You fool! Warren is dead. Weird Wilderness Stories, Volume 2. The Ash Tree by M.R. James. Everyone who has travelled over eastern England knows the smaller country houses with which it is studded. The rather dank little buildings, usually in the Italian style, surrounded with parks of some 80 to 100 acres. For me, they have always had a very strong attraction, with the grey paling of split oak, the noble trees, the meres with their reed beds, and the line of distant woods. Then I like the pillared portico, perhaps stuck onto a red brick Queen Anne house which has been faced with stucco to bring it into line with the Grecian taste of the end of the 18th century. The hall inside going up to the roof, which hall ought always to be provided with a gallery and a small organ. I like the library too, where you may find anything from a Psalter of the 13th century to a Shakespeare quarto. I like the pictures, of course, and perhaps most of all, I like fancying what life in such a house was when it was first built, and in the piping times of landlord's prosperity, and not least now, when, if money is not so plentiful, taste is more varied and life quite as interesting. I wish to have one of these houses, and enough money to keep it together and entertain my friends in it modestly. But this is a digression. I have to tell you of a curious series of events which happened in such a house as I have tried to describe. It is in Castringham Hall in Suffolk. I think a good deal has been done to the building since the period of my story, but the essential features I have sketched are still there. Italian portico, square block of white house, older inside than out, park with fringe of woods, and mere. The one feature that marked out the house from a score of others is gone. As you looked at it from the park, you saw on the right a great old ash tree growing within half a dozen yards of the wall, and almost or quite touching the building with its branches. I suppose it had stood there ever since Castringham ceased to be a fortified place, and since the moat was filled in and the Elizabethan dwelling house built. At any rate, it had well nigh attained its full dimensions in the year 1690. In that year, the district in which the hall is situated was the scene of a number of witch trials. It will be long, I think, before we arrive at a just estimate of the amount of solid reason, if there was any, which lay at the root of the universal fear of witches in old times. Whether the persons accused of this offence really did imagine that they were possessed of unusual power of any kind, or whether they had the will at least, if not the power, of doing mischief to their neighbours, or whether all the confessions, of which there are so many, were extorted by the cruelty of the witch-finders, these are questions which are not, I fancy, yet solved. And the present narrative gives me pause. I cannot altogether sweep it away as mere invention. The reader must judge for himself. Castringham contributed a victim to the auto-da-fe. Mrs. Mothersole was her name, and she differed from the ordinary run of village witches only in being rather better off and in a more influential position. Efforts were made to save her by several reputable farmers of the parish. They did their best to testify to her character, and showed considerable anxiety as to the verdict of the jury. But what seems to have been fatal to the woman was the evidence of the then proprietor of Castringham Hall, Sir Matthew Fell. He deposed to having watched her on 3 different occasions from his window at the full of the moon, gathering sprigs, and I quote, from the ash tree near my house. She had climbed into the branches, clad only in her shift, and was cutting off small twigs with a peculiarly curved knife, and as she did so, she seemed to be talking to herself. On each occasion, Sir Matthew had done his best to capture the woman, but she had always taken alarm at some accidental noise he had made, and all he could see when he got down to the garden was a hare running across the path in the direction of the village. On the 3rd night, he had been at the pains to follow at his best speed, and had gone straight to Mrs. Mothersole's house, but he had had to wait a quarter of an hour battering at her door, and then she had come out very cross, and apparently very sleepy, as if just out of bed, and he had no good explanation to offer of his visit. Mainly on this evidence, though there was much more of a less striking and unusual kind from other parishioners, Mrs. Mothersole was found guilty and condemned to die. She was hanged a week after the trial, with 5 or 6 more unhappy creatures at Bury St. Edmunds. Sir Matthew Fell, then deputy sheriff, was present at the execution. It was a damp, drizzly March morning when the cart made its way up the rough grass hill outside Northgate, where the gallows stood. The other victims were apathetic or broken down with misery, but Mrs. Mothersole was, as in life so in death, of a very different temper. Her poisonous rage, as a reporter of the time puts it, did so work upon the bystanders, even upon the hangman, that it was constantly affirmed of all that saw her that she presented the living aspect of a mad divil. Yet she offered no resistance to the officers of the law, only she looked upon those that laid hands upon her with so direful and venomous an aspect that, as one of them afterwards assured me, the mere thought of it preyed inwardly upon his mind for 6 months after. However, all that she is reported to have said were the seemingly meaningless words, "There will be guests at the Hall," which she repeated more than once in an undertone. Sir Matthew Fell was not unimpressed by the bearing of the woman. He had some talk upon the matter with the vicar of his parish, with whom he travelled home after the assize business was over. His evidence at the trial had not been very willingly given. He was not specially infected with the witch-finding mania, but he declared, then and afterwards, that he could not give any other account of the matter than that he had given, and that he could not possibly have been mistaken as to what he saw. The whole transaction had been repugnant to him, for he was a man who liked to be on pleasant terms with those about him, but he saw a duty to be done in this business, and he had done it. That seems to have been the gist of his sentiments, and the vicar applauded it, as any reasonable man must have done. A few weeks after, when the moon of May was at the full, vicar and squire met again in the park, and walked to the Hall together. Lady Fell was with her mother, who was dangerously ill, and Sir Matthew was alone at home, so the vicar, Mr. Crome, was easily persuaded to take a late supper at the Hall. Sir Matthew was not very good company this evening. The talk ran chiefly on family and parish matters, and, as luck would have it, Sir Matthew made a memorandum in writing of certain wishes or intentions of his regarding his estates, which afterwards proved exceedingly useful. When Mr. Crome thought of starting for home about 9:30, Sir Matthew and he took a preliminary turn on the gravelled walk at the back of the house. The only incident that struck Mr. Crome was this. They were in sight of the ash tree which I described as growing near the windows of the building, when Sir Matthew stopped and said, "What is that runs up and down the stem of the ash? It is never a squirrel. They will all be in their nests by now." The vicar looked and saw the moving creature, but he could make nothing of its colour in the moonlight. The sharp outline, however, seen for an instant, was imprinted on his brain, and he could have sworn, he said, though it sounded foolish, that, squirrel or not, it had more than 4 legs. Still, not much was to be made of the momentary vision, and the 2 men parted. They may have met since then, but it was not for a score of years. Next day, Sir Matthew Fell was not downstairs at 6 in the morning, as was his custom, nor at 7, nor yet at 8. Hereupon the servants went and knocked at his chamber door. I need not prolong the description of their anxious listenings and renewed batterings on the panels. The door was opened at last from the outside, and they found their master dead and black. So much you have guessed. That there were any marks of violence did not at the moment appear, but the window was open. One of the men went to fetch the parson, and then by his directions rode on to give notice to the coroner. Mr. Crome himself went as quick as he might to the Hall, and was shown to the room where the dead man lay. He has left some notes among his papers which show how genuine a respect and sorrow was felt for Sir Matthew, And there is also this passage, which I transcribe for the sake of the light it throws upon the course of events, and also upon the common beliefs of the time. There was not any the least trace of an entrance having been forced to the chamber, but the casement stood open, as my poor friend would always have it in this season. He had his evening drink of small ale in a silver vessel of about a pint measure, and tonight had not drunk it out. This drink was examined by the physician from Bury, a Mr. Hodgkins, who could not, however, as he afterwards declared upon his oath, before the coroner's quest, discover that any matter of a venomous kind was present in it. For, as was natural in the great swelling and blackness of the corpse, there was talk made among the neighbours of poison. The body was very much disordered, as it laid in the bed, being twisted after so extreme a sort as gave too probable conjecture that my worthy friend and patron had expired in great pain and agony. And what is as yet unexplained, and to myself the argument of some horrid and artful design in the perpetrators of this barbarous murder, was this, that the women which were entrusted with the laying out of the corpse and washing it, being both sad persons and very well respected in their mournful profession, came to me in a great pain and distress both of mind and body, saying, what was indeed confirmed upon the first view, that they had no sooner touched the breast of the corpse with their naked hands than they were sensible of a more than ordinary violent smart and aching in their palms, which, with their whole forearms, in no long time swelled so immoderately, the pain still continuing, that, as afterwards proved, during many weeks they were forced to lay by the exercise of their calling, and yet no mark seen on the skin. Upon hearing this, I sent for the physician, who was still in the house, and we made as careful a proof as we were able, by the help of a small magnifying lens of crystal, of the condition of the skin on this part of the body, but could not detect with the instrument we had any matter of importance beyond a couple of small punctures or pricks, which we then concluded were the spots by which the poison might be introduced, remembering that ring of Pope Borgia, with other known specimens of the horrid art of the Italian poisoners of the last age. So much is to be said of the symptoms seen on the corpse. As to what I am to add, it is merely my own experiment, and to be left to posterity to judge whether there be anything of value therein. There was on the table by the bedside a Bible of the small size, in which my friend, punctual as in matters of less moment, so in this more weighty one, used nightly, and upon his first rising, to read a set portion. And I, taking it up, not without a tear duly paid to him, which from the study of this poor adumbration was now passed to the contemplation of its great original, it came into my thoughts, as at such moments of helplessness we are prone to catch at any the least glimmer that makes promise of light, to make trial of that old and by many accounted superstitious practice of drawing the sortes, of which a principal instance, in the case of his late sacred majesty, the blessed martyr King Charles, and my Lord Falkland, was now much talked of. I must admit that by my trial not much assistance was afforded me, yet, as the cause and origin of these dreadful events may hereafter be searched out, I set down the results, in the case it may be found that they pointed the true quarter of the mischief to a quicker intelligence than my own. I made then 3 trials, opening the book and placing my finger upon certain words, which gave in the first these words from Luke 13:7, cut it down. In the second, Isaiah 13:20, it shall never be inhabited. And upon the third experiment, Job 39:30, her young ones also suck up blood. This is all that need be quoted from Mr. Crome's papers. Sir Matthew Fell was duly coffined and laid into the earth, and his funeral sermon, preached by Mr. Crome on the following Sunday, has been printed under the title of The Unsearchable Way, or England's Danger in the Malicious Dealings of Antichrist, it being the vicar's view, as well as that most commonly held in the neighbourhood, that the squire was the victim of a recrudescence of the popish plot. His son, Sir Matthew II, succeeded to the title and estates, and so ends the first act of the Castringham tragedy. It is to be mentioned, though the fact is not surprising, that the new baronet did not occupy the room in which his father had died, nor indeed was it slept in by any one but an occasional visitor during the whole of his occupation. He died in 1735, and I do not find that anything particular marked his reign, save a curiously constant mortality among his cattle and livestock in general, which showed a tendency to increase slightly as time went on. Those who are interested in the details will find a statistical account in a letter to the Gentleman's Magazine of 1772, which draws the facts from the baronet's own papers. He put an end to it at last by a very simple expedient, that of shutting up all his beasts in sheds at night, and keeping no sheep in his park, for he had noticed that nothing was ever attacked that spent the night indoors. After that, the disorder confined itself to wild birds and beasts of chase, but as we have no good account of the symptoms, and as all-night watching was quite unproductive of any clue, I do not dwell on what the Suffolk farmers called the Castringham sickness. The second Sir Matthew died in 1735, as I said, and was duly succeeded by his son, Sir Richard. It was in his time that the great family pew was built out on the north side of the parish church. So large were the squire's ideas that several of the graves on that unhallowed side of the building had to be disturbed to satisfy his requirements. Among them was that of Mrs. Mothersole, the position of which was accurately known, thanks to a note on a plan of the church and yard, both made by Mr. Crome. A certain amount of interest was excited in the village when it was known that the famous witch, who was still remembered by a few, was to be exhumed, and the feeling of surprise, and indeed disquiet, was very strong when it was found that, though her coffin was fairly sound and unbroken, there was no trace whatever inside it of body, bones, or dust. Indeed, it is a curious phenomenon, for at the time of her burying no such things were dreamt of as resurrection men, and it is difficult to conceive any rational motive for stealing a body otherwise than for the uses of the dissecting room. The incident revived for a time all the stories of witch trials and of the exploits of the witches, dormant for 40 years, and Sir Richard's orders that the coffin should be burnt were thought by a good many to be rather foolhardy, though they were duly carried out. Sir Richard was a pestilent innovator, it is certain. Before his time, the hall had been a fine block of the mellowest red brick, but Sir Richard had travelled in Italy and become infected with the Italian taste, and having more money than his predecessors, he determined to leave an Italian palace where he had found an English house. So stucco and ashlar masked the brick. Some indifferent Roman marbles were planted about in the entrance hall and gardens. A reproduction of the Sibyl's Temple at Tivoli was erected on the opposite bank of the mere, and Castringham took on an entirely new, and I must say a less engaging aspect. But it was much admired, and served as a model to a good many of the neighbouring gentry in after years. One morning, it was in 1754, Sir Richard woke after a night of discomfort. It had been windy, and his chimney had smoked persistently, and yet it was so cold that he must keep up a fire. Also, something had so rattled about the window that no man could get a moment's peace. Further, there was the prospect of several guests of position arriving in the course of the day, who would expect sport of some kind, and the inroads of the distemper which continued among his game had been lately so serious that he was afraid for his reputation as a game preserver. But what really touched him most nearly was the other matter of his sleepless night. He could certainly not sleep in that room again. That was the chief subject of his meditations at breakfast, and after it he began a systematic examination of the rooms to see which would suit his notions best. It was long before he found one. This had a window with an eastern aspect, and that with a northern. This door the servants would be always passing, and he did not like the bedstead in that. No, he must have a room with a western lookout, so that the sun could not wake him early, and it must be out of the way of the business of the house. The housekeeper was at the end of her resources. "Well, Sir Richard," she said, "you know that there is but the one room like that in the house." "Which may that be?" said Sir Richard. "And that is Sir Matthew's, the west chamber." "Well, put me in there, for there are light tonight," said her master. "Which way is it? Here, to be sure." And he hurried off. "Oh, Sir Richard, but no one has slept there these 40 years. The air has hardly been changed since Sir Matthew died there." Thus she spoke, and rustled after him. "Come, open the door, Mrs. Chiddock. I'll see the chamber at least." So it was opened, and, indeed, the smell was very close and earthy. Sir Richard crossed to the window, and, impatiently, as was his wont, threw the shutters back, and flung open the casement. For this end of the house was one which the alterations had barely touched, grown up as it was with a great ash-tree, and being otherwise concealed from view. "Air it, Mrs. Chiddock, all to-day, and move my bed furniture in the afternoon. Put the Bishop of Kilmore in my old room." "Pray, Sir Richard," said a new voice, breaking in on this speech, "might I have the favour of a moment's interview?" Sir Richard turned round, and saw a man in black in the doorway, who bowed. "I must ask your indulgence for this intrusion, Sir Richard. You will, perhaps, hardly remember me. My name is William Crome, and my grandfather was vicar in your grandfather's time." "Well, sir," said Sir Richard, "the name of Crome is always a passport to Castringham. I am glad to renew a friendship of 2 generations' standing. In what can I serve you? For your hour of calling, and if I do not mistake you, your bearing, shows you to be in some haste." "That is no more than the truth, sir. I am riding from Norwich to Bury St. Edmunds with what haste I can make, and I have called in on my way to leave with you some papers, which we have but just come upon in looking over what my grandfather left at his death. It is thought you may find some matters of family interest in them." "You are mighty obliging, Mr. Crome, and if you will be so good as to follow me to the parlour and drink a glass of wine, we will take a first look at these same papers together. And you, Mrs. Chiddock, as I said, be about airing this chamber. Yes, it is here my grandfather died. Yes, the tree perhaps does make the place a little dampish. No, I do not wish to listen to any more. Make no difficulties, I beg. You have your orders. Go. Will you follow me, sir?" They went to the study. The packet which young Mr. Crome had brought, he was then just become a fellow of Clare Hall in Cambridge, I may say, and subsequently brought out a respectable edition of Polyaenus, contained, among other things, the notes which the old vicar had made upon the occasion of Sir Matthew Fell's death. And for the first time, Sir Richard was confronted with the enigmatical sortes biblicae, which you have heard. They amused him a good deal. "Well," he said, "my grandfather's Bible gave one prudent piece of advice. Cut it down. If that stands for the ash-tree, he may rest assured I shall not neglect it. Such a nest of catarrhs and agues was never seen." The parlour contained the family books, which, pending the arrival of a collection which Sir Richard had made in Italy, and the building of a proper room to receive them, were not many in number. Sir Richard looked up from the paper to the bookcase. "I wonder," says he, "whether the old prophet is there yet. I fancy I see him." Crossing the room, he took out a dumpy Bible, which, sure enough, bore on the fly-leaf the inscription, "To Matthew Fell, from his loving godmother, Anne Aldous, 2nd of September, 1659. "It would be no bad plan to test him again, Mr. Crome. I will wager we get a couple of names in the chronicles. What have we here? 'Thou shalt seek me in the morning, and I shall not be.' Well, well, your grandfather would have made a fine omen of that, eh? No more prophets for me. They are all in a tale. And now, Mr. Crome, I am infinitely obliged to you for your packet. You will, I fear, be impatient to get on. Pray allow me another glass." So, with offers of hospitality, which were genuinely meant, for Sir Richard thought well of the young man's address and manner, they parted. In the afternoon came the guests, the Bishop of Kilmore, Lady Mary Hervey, Sir William Kentfield, etc., dinner at 5, wine, cards, supper, and dispersal to bed. Next morning, Sir Richard is disinclined to take his gun with the rest. He talks with the Bishop of Kilmore. This prelate, unlike a good many of the Irish bishops of his day, had visited his see, and, indeed, resided there, for some considerable time. This morning, as the two were walking along the terrace and talking over the alterations and improvements in the house, the bishop said, pointing to the window of the west room, "You could never get one of my Irish flock to occupy that room, Sir Richard." "Why is that, my lord? It is, in fact, my own." Well, our Irish peasantry will always have it that it brings the worst of luck to sleep near an ash tree, and you have a fine growth of ash not 2 yards from your chamber window. Perhaps, the bishop went on with a smile, it has given you a touch of its quality already, for you do not seem, if I may say it, so much the fresher for your night's rest as your friends would like to see you. That, or something else, it is true, cost me my sleep from 12 to 4, my lord, but the tree is to come down tomorrow, so I shall not hear much more from it. I applaud your determination. It can hardly be wholesome to have the air you breathe strained, as it were, through all that leafage. Your lordship is right there, I think, but I had not my window open last night. It was rather the noise that went on, no doubt from the twigs sweeping the glass, that kept me open-eyed. I think that can hardly be, Sir Richard. Here, you see it from this point. None of these nearest branches even can touch your casement unless there were a gale, and there was none of that last night. They missed the panes by a foot. No, sir, true. What then will it be, I wonder, that scratched and rustled so? Aye, and covered the dust on my sill with lines and marks. At last they agreed that the rats must have come up through the ivy. That was the bishop's idea, and Sir Richard jumped at it. So the day passed quietly, and night came, and the party dispersed to their rooms, and wished Sir Richard a better night. And now we're in his bedroom, with the light out, and the squire in bed. The room is over the kitchen, and the night outside still and warm, so the window stands open. There is very little light about the bedstead, but there is a strange movement there. It seems as if Sir Richard were moving his head rapidly to and fro, with only the slightest possible sound. And now you would guess, so deceptive is the half-darkness, that he had several heads, round and brownish, which move back and forward, even as low as his chest. It is a horrible illusion. Is it nothing more? There, something drops off the bed with a soft plump, like a kitten, and is out of the window in a flash. Another, 4, and after that there is quiet again. Thou shalt seek me in the morning, and I shall not be. As with Sir Matthew, so with Sir Richard, dead and black in his bed. A pale and silent party of guests and servants gathered under the window when the news was known. Italian poisoners, popish emissaries, infected air, all these and more guesses were hazarded, and the Bishop of Kilmore looked at the tree, in the fork of whose lower boughs a white tomcat was crouching, looking down the hollow which years had gnawed in the trunk. It was watching something inside the tree with great interest. Suddenly it got up and craned over the hole. Then a bit of the edge on which it stood gave way, and it went slithering in. Everyone looked up at the noise of the fall. It is known to most of us that a cat can cry, but few of us have heard, I hope, such a yell as came out of the trunk of the great ash. 2 or 3 screams there were, the witnesses are not sure which, and then a slight and muffled noise of some commotion or struggling was all that came. But Lady Mary Hervey fainted outright, and the housekeeper stopped her ears and fled till she fell on the terrace. The Bishop of Kilmore and Sir William Kentfield stayed, yet even they were daunted, though it was only at the cry of a cat, and Sir William swallowed once or twice before he could say, "There is something more than we know of in that tree, my lord. I'm for an instant search." And this was agreed upon. A ladder was brought, and one of the gardeners went up, and, looking down the hollow, could detect nothing but a few dim indications of something moving. They got a lantern and let it down by a rope. "We must get at the bottom of this, my life upon it, my lord, but the secret of these terrible deaths is there." Up went the gardener again with the lantern, and let it down the hole cautiously. They saw the yellow light upon his face as he bent over, and saw his face struck with an incredulous terror and loathing, before he cried out in a dreadful voice and fell back from the ladder, where happily he was caught by 2 of the men, letting the lantern fall inside the tree. He was in a dead faint, and it was some time before any word could be got from him. By then, they had something else to look at. The lantern must have broken at the bottom, and the light in it caught upon dry leaves and rubbish that lay there, for in a few minutes a dense smoke began to come up, and then flame, and, to be short, the tree was in a blaze. The bystanders made a ring at some yards' distance, and Sir William and the bishop sent men to get what weapons and tools they could, for, clearly, whatever might be using the tree as its lair would be forced out by the fire. So it was. First, at the fork, they saw a round body covered with fire, the size of a man's head, appear very suddenly, then seem to collapse and fall back. This 5 or 6 times, then a similar ball leapt into the air and fell on the grass, where after a moment it lay still. The bishop went as near as he dared to it, and saw what but the remains of an enormous spider, veinous and seared. And, as the fire burned lower down, more terrible bodies like this began to break out from the trunk, and it was seen that these were covered with greyish hair. All that day the ash burned, and until it fell to pieces the men stood about it, and from time to time killed the brutes as they darted out. At last there was a long interval when none appeared, and they cautiously closed in and examined the roots of the tree. They found, says the Bishop of Kilmore, below it a rounded hollow place in the earth, wherein were 2 or 3 bodies of these creatures that had plainly been smothered by the smoke, and, what is to me more curious, at the side of this den, against the wall, was crouching the anatomy or skeleton of a human being, with the skin dried upon the bones, having some remains of black hair, which was pronounced by those that examined it to be undoubtedly the body of a woman, and clearly dead for a period of 50 years. The Sunken Land by George W. Bailey. It was 11 o'clock in the morning when Tom O'Grady and I rode into a remote little Cree village, some hundreds of miles northwest of Edmonton, Alberta. We were both members of the Royal Canadian Northwest Mounted Police, commonly called Mounties, and wore the scarlet jacket of that famous force. We had been detailed for special duty to find and bring back the slayers of a certain individual at Athabasca Landing. When last noticed, the murderers had been headed in this direction, but since then 2 months had elapsed, and we had not obtained the faintest trace of their whereabouts. It was, therefore, without much hope that we rode through the scattered lodges in search of the chief of the roving band. As we approached the centre of the village, our attention was attracted by a small crowd of Indians standing and squatting in a large semicircle around a solitary white man seated on a soap-box at the entrance to the chief's lodge. The man was sturdy and thick-set, and gave one the impression of possessing great physical strength. His present attitude was one of calm and complete detachment, but as we approached, he turned his head in our direction and called out, "Hello, Gerald! Hello, Tom! You're the very men I want to see." It was the Dominion government doctor on one of his periodical visits to the wandering tribes in that section of the Northwest Territories. "What's up?" I asked, dismounting. "I found a dead white man in here," he answered, "and at the same time I've unearthed a mystery. Sit down and I'll show you." As soon as we were seated, he took a small matchbox from his pocket and handed it to me. Inside it there were 10 small stones. I examined them carefully. "They're diamonds," I said. "Now look at this." And he took a rough, torn piece of brown paper out of his pocketbook. On the paper, evidently part of a rough diary, were the following disjointed notes. "Entered the Sunken Land. S. Lost. No Ip. Blue Clay Island. Latitude 60 degrees by 30 minutes. Longitude 127 degrees 10 minutes. 150 miles. Be very sick. Must gie ack. One glance at this scrap of paper was enough to show me that we were on the trail of the murderers. S could mean but one thing. Sam Elliott, one of the men we were after, and B must be Bad Bill Blake. Now, let's see the dead man. If it's the one I think it is, we'll know where to find the others. Eh, Tom? We followed the doctor into the teepee. One look was enough. Pat Corbeau, the ringleader of the gang, had committed his last crime. It was now up to us to gather in his accomplices, dead or alive. "When do we start?" asked the doctor as we came out into the sunlight once more. "We?" I said. "Are you coming with us then?" "Why not?" he answered shortly. "Don't get sore, Doc. We'll be tickled to death to have you, but it's going to be one hell of a boring trip." "That's where you're wrong," said the doctor. "I've heard rumors of this Sunken Land, though I've never met a soul that's been there. But that there's something uncanny and altogether horrible about the place, I fully believe. Take that scrap of diary, for instance. Read it by what's left unsaid, and you'll see what I mean." "Nice, cheery document," I remarked as I glanced at it again. "We'll bury Pat this afternoon and start off on trail tomorrow forenoon. How does that hit you, Doc?" "Fine," said that laconic individual without turning, as he strode off towards his own tent on the outskirts of the encampment. "Now we eat." We followed him a few paces behind. It was 2 weeks later. The day was far advanced, and the sun, low on the distant horizon, was sinking into a bed of heavy black clouds. Away to the south, a range of mountains stood sharply silhouetted against the sky. We were preparing camp, quietly, steadily, methodically, for the spirit of the trail had taken hold of us, and conversation was reduced to a minimum. The horses had been taken back by the Indians some 4 days previously, and we were now entirely upon our own resources. We stood on the threshold of the unknown. Up to that point, our journey had been a commonplace of northern travel. Work, danger, monotony, they had all come in the day's run. We had crossed many rivers, we had traversed a mountain range, until one day we had descended to a vast plain which stretched northwest as far as the eye could reach. This plain was typical northern country, grassland alternating with stretches of stunted black spruce and white birch, and stretches there were, too, where sand and glacial boulders predominated, but this was all past. In front of us, straight into the sunset, lay a low range of undulating hills. After supper, we smoked in silence for a time. Finally, the doctor pointed to the hills. "If I'm not mistaken, the Sunken Land begins beyond that low range. What latitude and longitude did you make it at noon today, Gerald?" I took out my notebook. My observation gave us an approximate latitude of 61 degrees 50 minutes and a longitude of 126 degrees 40 minutes. The sun was rather obscured, so I can't be quite certain of my figures. "That's near enough," said the doctor. "We enter the Sunken Land tomorrow, and don't forget our agreement. Not one of us must ever, even for an instant, be separated from the other two. There's something queer about that country, and it's through getting separated that other party came to grief. At least that's the way I have it figured. So let's keep together." The next morning we began the climb of the low range. Following a little valley, we slowly ascended until we came to where it flattened out. We had reached the top. In front and below stretched a panorama of broken country, low hills alternating everywhere with plains. But the astonishing thing was that the whole country sloped downwards. As far as the eye could reach, the hills continued. "The whole land seems to have sunk," said Tom. "That hill on the horizon line must be thousands of feet below us." I took out my field glasses and focused them on the horizon line. "I can't see any sign of the lake," I said, as I handed them to the doctor. "I don't suppose you can," he remarked. "If that diary is correct, it's 150 miles from here." All day we travelled carefully, warily, expecting every moment to have to defend our lives against some hidden peril. But nothing out of the ordinary occurred. During the past weeks, we had often discussed the fate of the men who had preceded us into this land, but the subject was baffling, as we had no clue as to the manner of their death. Now that we had actually seen the country spread out before us, a feeling of vague alarm had taken hold of us. None of us could explain why. The country looked so very peaceful, but I could not help thinking of a story I had read, where ants the size of rats and of unparalleled ferocity inhabited a tract of barren rolling country somewhere on the borders of Afghanistan, and devoured all that came in their path. No animals could escape, as they could run with incredible swiftness. Consequently, the country was entirely denuded of game. I told this tale to my companions, and though they appeared to treat it as a joke, I noticed that their watchfulness increased. Sometimes we climbed the rounded hills, at others we descended their farther slopes, but always the descent was longer than the ascent. Towards the end of the second day, we noticed a distinct change in the temperature. The country was getting warmer. Vegetation, too, began to increase. Scattered pine, tamarack, and birch trees became more numerous, and game became abundant, thus exploding the ant theory. Rabbits, in particular, seemed to overrun the whole country, while deer were quite plentiful. But the face of the country was undergoing a steady change. Woods were appearing. Taking the place of scattered trees, alder and ash also became abundant, and finally I noticed a stunted elm. "I say, by Jove, this is interesting," said Tom. "See the squirrels and small birds? Why, the country is simply crawling with game." Being interested in forestry, I found this change in forest conditions fascinating in the extreme. The country was, in fact, a paradise. Nothing untoward had yet happened, and all sense of approaching disaster seemed to have vanished. The very air seemed clearer. In fact, we acted as if the danger were behind, rather than in front of us, unless the diary lied. That night we camped by a small stream, and rising early the next morning, had been on the march for a couple of hours, when Tom suddenly stopped. "Do you fellows notice anything?" We stood still and listened. "I can't say I hear anything," said I. "Nor I," said the doctor. "That's it," Tom replied. "There's nothing to hear. The game's gone. I haven't seen a rabbit or heard a bird for the last hour." We looked at each other. "That's true," I said. "I wonder what's the trouble." We looked carefully on every side. The country seemed the same. "Nothing's changed from yesterday," said Tom finally. "The trees are larger," I remarked. "And there seem to be more creepers," added the doctor. "There's something queer about this," sputtered Tom. "Keep your rifles ready." At noon, we stopped in a little grassy clearing. "Look, there's a rabbit," I cried. "See the way it's running? Something's chasing it." We sprang to our feet, seizing our rifles. The creature tore past us without even noticing our presence, squealing as if in the most mortal terror, and disappeared in the opposite direction. Then all was still again. Not a sound broke the stillness. "I don't know," said the doctor. I feel as if something were watching us." "Yes, I feel that same way," said Tom. "But it's only natural. Fear is catching, even a rabbit's. It was probably only a weasel." We agreed heartily, too heartily perhaps. "Let's be moving," I suggested. Before us, the forest appeared much thicker, and the trees much larger, and I pointed out some oak and beech, as well as a few very large elms. The temperature was almost oppressively hot. That night, when we camped, we chose an open space and lit a large fire, taking turns to keep watch, but nothing tangible occurred. The night was oppressively still, Yet all through the night there were vague sounds of rustling and faint whisperings, now louder, now fainter. That was all. There was an uncanny strangeness about it which made us distinctly uneasy. The next morning we talked it over, and the doctor's opinion was that if at any time we were out at night, it would be a good plan to carry torches. This suggestion met with approval, so we spent an hour before starting out in making a few for each of us, and fastened them to our pack-sacks. All next day the temperature kept rising, and as we progressed the vegetation became more and more tropical. We were now progressing in single file along a trail, made in all probability by the ill-fated party which had preceded us, as the forest growth had not yet had time to obliterate the recent traces of man's handiwork. As night approached, we began to look around for an open clearing, for the prospect of spending the night in the thick undergrowth among these giant trees in the presence of an unknown peril was far from reassuring. To make matters worse, the ground was becoming swampy. Little stagnant pools and rotting vegetation appeared on every side, making the going more and more difficult. Suddenly Tom, who was leading, stopped and remarked, "It's no use going on. This may get worse and worse instead of better, and we can't camp here, so I think we'd better go back to the last clearing we passed. How far do you think it is, Doc?" 2 miles, I should think." "All right, then. About turn, and we'll have to hurry. The sun's just setting." The darkness came on quickly, the great trees shutting out the afterglow, and we were soon straggling along in a very uneven manner, the doctor now leading, and Tom bringing up the rear. The uneasy feeling of the previous night began to take hold of us, and at the same time our resolution about torches flashed into my mind. Without a moment's pause, I stopped, and calling to the others, pulled out a torch and lit it. The others did the same. "That's better," said Tom. "Now we can at least see where we're going." But the flare and flicker of the smoky torches only seemed to accentuate the darkness of the forest about us, and as I glanced from side to side, I felt sure that, again, an evil presence, a gruesome, nameless terror, was keeping pace with us on either hand. I spoke about it to the others. They, too, felt the same fear. The night was dreadfully still, but again we noticed a faint whispering sound, but now it seemed all around us. Suddenly, the whispering seemed to grow louder and more menacing. I saw the doctor start to run. Already he appeared a long way ahead. All at once, his torch disappeared from view, for the trail had taken a bend. At that moment, I too started to run, wildly. I had felt something soft and clammy grasp my throat, while I thought I felt innumerable little feelers gripping my face and body. With a scream, I fought them off with my torch, and realized a moment later that my nerve was going, and that the little feelers had only been a creeper in the branches of some trees. A moment later, I was running close behind the doctor. Suddenly, I turned round. "My God!" I cried. "Where's Tom?" We started down the trail, the hair literally rising on our heads. There was nothing but black darkness behind us, and from the darkness came a hum as of angry bees. Suddenly, there was a distant shout. "Gerald! Gerald! Come back! My torch has gone out!" And then came a prolonged scream of agony and terror. "Help, Gerald! Help!" followed by a choking cry of mortal terror. Then silence. Throwing off our packs, we raced along the trail at top speed. When we reached the spot where he had been, we found his rifle and his pack, evidently thrown off in the desperation of a fight for life. And that was all. Tom had completely vanished. We searched the ground with our torches, and called and fired our rifles, but all to no purpose. No sound broke the stillness of the night. Even the whispering had ceased. We returned to the trail, and fetching our packs, we brought them back to the place where Tom had disappeared. Then we gave way to utter despair. How long we sat I don't know, but it must have been some considerable time, for the first thing that roused us was the dying splutter of my torch, which had been stuck into the ground at our feet. This effectually brought us back to a sense of our position, and to the danger of thus sitting still. I lit another torch, and turned to the doctor. "What are we to do now?" I asked. "I'm sure I don't know," he answered. "Camp here, I suppose, and light a large fire. We'll have to wait for daylight before we can do anything." As soon as we had a good fire going, we put out our torches, and making ourselves as comfortable as the swampy condition of the ground would allow, we lit our pipes and settled down to wait for morning. An hour passed. Then, softly, ever so softly, a faint, almost imperceptible murmur began to come from the treetops. "Sounds like a breeze," I said, tilting my head a trifle to listen. "Yes, it does," assented the doctor. "But, unfortunately, we know it's no such thing. Throw some more wood on the fire." "What do you think it is?" I asked, as in strained attention we listened to the increasing murmur. "God knows," answered the doctor with a shrug. "Do you think a rifle is any good against it?" I went on. "No, I do not," he replied shortly. "Why?" "To tell you the truth, I don't know," he said. "I've been thinking over the events of the last few hours," I went on, "and there are one or two things that strike me as especially curious." "For instance?" suggested the doctor. "Well, for one thing," I said, "we're in a far northern latitude, yet because this country is many thousands of feet below the upper plain, the temperature has increased to such an extent that all the conditions of life down here are tropical." "Yes, yes," interrupted the doctor impatiently. "I know all that. We've discussed it many times." "But this is my point," I said. "These are not the tropics. This is an entirely abnormal condition. Therefore, life as we know it may have undergone a complete change, or at least a modification." The doctor nodded. "Go on." "In that case, the animal and vegetable life may have characteristics entirely unknown to us, and quite foreign to those with which we are accustomed to deal." The doctor was lost in thought. "I see what you mean, but don't generalize. Come down to something definite." "That I can't do," I answered. "But I have a suspicion that this thing which is menacing us is more or less impalpable, but is armed with innumerable feelers, which I actually felt round my throat and on my face and all over my body a while ago." The doctor abruptly sat up. "By God, that's true," he cried. "I remember feeling them too, but I thought I was imagining things, and decided they were only creepers and branches of trees after all." "That's not all," I went on. "The thing can only see at night. Light apparently blinds it." "In that case," said the doctor, "our best hope lies in our knives and hatchets and in having plenty of light. Throw on some more wood, Gerald." The next morning we were up at the first hint of daylight, and after a hurried breakfast, determined to prosecute a thorough search for our missing companion, in the faint hope that we might at least gain some clue as to the manner of his death. Plunging into the undergrowth, we soon struck a small stream, and, advancing in single file along the bank, found that it narrowed down to a mere brook, and finally lost itself in a great green morass of sponge-like mosses, into which we sank up to our knees. The place was horribly haunted by clouds of enormous and most venomous mosquitoes. The swamp seemed to extend without end, in front and on either side of us. "It's no use," said the doctor. "We'll have to give it up and go back and make our way to the lake as quickly as possible." All day we travelled along the narrow trail, making a slow but steady speed. For a forest land it was the most wonderful that the imagination of man could conceive. The thick vegetation met overhead, interlacing into a natural pergola, and at last through this tunnel of verdure in a golden twilight we caught sight of the lake, beautiful in itself, but marvellous from the strange tints thrown by the light from above, filtering through the foliage. Clear as crystal, motionless as a sheet of glass, green as the edge of an iceberg, it stretched before us. In the centre was a small conical island, entirely denuded of trees, while at our feet, where the trail ended, lay a small raft embedded in the mud. "There's our boat," I said. "Well, we still have about an hour of daylight," said the doctor. "That treeless island looks the most beautiful place in the world to me at this moment." Whether it was the sound of our voices or something else, I don't know, but at that instant the whispering began in the tree-tops, and from moment to moment the sound increased. Looking up, we saw leaves and twigs in violent motion high in the crowns of the trees. Too astounded to move, we watched the strange phenomenon. Suddenly, without any warning, the whole tree seemed to spring into life. The giant branches curved down and swept the ground, and every twig and leaf seemed to be stretching out towards us. And at that moment, as if aroused by the clamour of the tree, every plant and shrub began to stir with life, violently agitating their long tentacle-like stems, the edges of which, rasping upon each other, produced a whispering or hissing noise. "Good God!" screamed the doctor. "The trees! The trees! I'm caught! Use your hatchet!" I cried, as I sprang to his rescue and severed a long, sinuous tendril that had twined itself round his waist. At the same instant, I felt a steel-like vice closing round my ankle, and fell heavily. Turning, I saw an enormous plant which had been near the path, waving its tentacles like a huge octopus. It had a short, thick trunk, from the top of which radiated giant tentacles, narrow and flexible, but of extraordinary tenaciousness. The edges were armed with barbs or dagger-like teeth. It was one of these sinewy feelers which, inclined at an angle from the trunk, had laid itself flat upon the ground, and at the touch of my boot had arisen and, like a giant serpent, had entwined itself about me, and was drawing me towards the centre of the stump, where my body would soon have been crushed, until every drop of blood had been squeezed out of it and absorbed by the ferocious plant. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead as I noticed other feelers flailing the air in search of me, and in the frenzy of despair I slashed at the tendril round my leg, and with 2 quick blows severed it. Immediately it rolled itself up into the parent stem. "Run! Run!" I yelled to the doctor. "Into the lake!" Tripping and falling and rising again, and slashing to right and left as I ran, cut and bleeding from the giant barbs, I rushed into the lake. Turning, I saw the doctor madly cutting at a creeper that had him by one arm. In another instant he was free from it, and with a frenzied bound was in the lake beside me, his clothes all torn and his face streaming with blood. We were up to our waists in water, but safe for the moment from that frightful nightmare. We watched with gruesome fascination the madly tossing forest, the long feelers still groping and searching for us. "Isn't it ghastly?" I said. We were nearly sick with the horror of what we had escaped, but when I had sufficiently recovered my mind, and some wind and some of my nerve had come back, I began to look around for some means of escape from the predicament in which we found ourselves. My first thought was of the raft. It looked small, and seemed firmly embedded in the mud. However, with only a small amount of effort, we were able to launch it and climb aboard. It was nearly flush with water, but with care we were able to cross safely, propelling ourselves by means of a crude sort of sweep which was fastened to one end. That night, after a good meal from our fast-diminishing stores, we slept the sleep of utter exhaustion, untroubled as yet by any fears for the future. Next morning, we found our cuts and scratches very sore, but with plenty of iodine and a roll of bandage, we were soon fixed up and ready for the exploration of Blue Clay Island. Climbing the conical hill, we found, as I expected, that the center of the island consisted of the crater of a small, extinct volcano, the floor of which was covered with blue clay mixed with small boulders. "There's your diamond clay," I said. The doctor nodded. We descended into the cup-shaped valley, and soon found the spot where the murderers had started to excavate. We spent the rest of the day then looking for gems and turning over the solid clay, but we were only rewarded with one minute stone. Whether our want of success was due to lack of experience or to the fact that we did not dig deep enough, I can't say. But the fact remains that that stone was the only one we ever got from the mine. From this time on, our every effort was bent towards trying to find a way of escape, but we were stopped at every turn. We circled the lake in an endeavor to find a landing place, but everywhere the trees seemed to sense our approach, and we dared not land. 2 or 3 days passed in this way, while we grew more and more desperate. Finally, on the evening of the 4th day, as we were sitting by our fire, smoking, our energy almost exhausted, the doctor spoke, deep dejection in his tone. "It's no use, Gerald. I give up. We'll either have to try to make our way through the forest where we came in, or die of starvation. We have only a few more days' grub left." "Before we do anything as rash as that," I remarked, "let's tell each other all we know about this place. Put all our cards on the table, and we may be able to work something out when we have our data all together. I'll begin. To start with, look at the forest now. Not a leaf stirring, is there?" The doctor looked intently at the shoreline with my field glasses. "No, everything is as calm and peaceful as possible. Now, watch the trees." I took a fair-sized stone and threw it into the lake about a quarter of the way across. There was a big splash. "Any sign?" I asked. "No." "Well, look at the waterline where it meets the shore by the big pine, and keep looking, and tell me when the ripples get there." "All right," he said a moment later. "They're lapping the bank." "Now look at the tops," I directed. The doctor uttered an ejaculation. "That's a remarkable thing. They're all in motion. Whatever made you think of that, Gerald?" "You see," I went on, "how hopeless it is to try to reach the shore without letting the trees know of our approach." "That's true," said the doctor. "But we can land on that little sand beach just to the right of the path." "Yes, that's point number 2. And number 3 is, the nearer the lake, the fiercer the trees." "I don't see any more points," said the doctor slowly. For a long time we sat moodily, staring into the fire. Then, slowly at first, but finally with a flash of inspiration, the idea came, and I smiled. The doctor, who had been watching me dejectedly, suddenly exclaimed, "You've got a plan, Gerald. Spit it out." I pointed to the fire. "We'll burn the forest," I said. Ever since our first entry into the Sunken Land, the weather had been dry. Consequently, the timber on the island, which, as the diary showed, had all been cut down by our predecessors, was in first-class condition to start a fire. The only question was, would that forest burn? "We'll have to build a bonfire on the beach and have everything all set for the first big wind from the northwest," I said. "A regular funeral pyre," remarked the doctor. For the next 2 days we toiled from daylight to dark, ferrying logs and brushwood across the lake and scientifically building a large square pile, which covered the center beach and, at the apex, for the top was conical, was nearly 15 feet high. The forest at this point consisted of a pure stand of pine, mostly longleaf, with some loblolly admixture, which was a great piece of luck for us, as this pine is highly resinous. Our preparations were now all made. The wind only was wanting. We made a number of torches, and got everything in readiness. Then, while waiting for the weather to change, tried our luck with the blue clay once more, but with no success. 4 days passed. Then, one night, I was awakened by feeling a strong breeze from the northwest blowing over me. Quickly rousing the doctor, we sat up and listened. "It's rising," I said. Yes, it's rising, but we're going to have rain. We haven't a minute to lose. Hurrying down to the raft, we paddled across. When we got back to the island, our landing was as bright as day in the light of that enormous fire, which, fanned by the rising wind, was roaring above the tops of the nearest trees. "Let's go up to the highest point of the island," I suggested, "so that we can follow the course the fire takes with our field glasses." The conflagration was now well within the pine stand, and was already beginning to spread fanwise. Momentarily the wind increased, driving clouds of sparks and dense clouds of smoke high into the air. We watched it, fascinated. Our lives hung upon the result. I handed the glasses to the doctor. "The fire has reached the mixed forest. Will the deciduous trees burn?" The doctor pointed to the east. "Look, Gerald, the dawn." "I feel a drop of rain," I said. Overhead, heavy grey rain clouds were tearing across the sky. "Let's cross," suggested the doctor. "No use," I replied. "We'll have to wait until tomorrow morning." Late in the afternoon, we crossed to have a look at things. The rain was coming down in torrents, and the wind had dropped a gusty breeze. We made our way into the charred forest for a couple of 100 yards. Nothing molested us. Apparently our way lay open. The next morning, we made an early start, for the weather had cleared and a bright sun was shining. We followed the path of the fire all morning until we reached the edge of the green morass where Tom had disappeared. Here, the fire had burned itself out, but its purpose had been accomplished. We were safe. The object of the expedition, from an official point of view, had been achieved, but at a terrible cost. Poor Tom had paid with his life, and to us the price seemed far too high. It is true that no trace of the last of the murderers, Blake, had been found, but we had had sufficient proof of the impossibility of escaping from the island in any other way than that which we had taken. He had tried to pass the forest, and had failed. The Interlopers by Saki. In a forest of mixed growth, somewhere on the eastern spurs of the Carpathians, a man stood one winter night watching and listening, as though he waited for some beast of the woods to come within the range of his vision, and later of his rifle. But the game for whose presence he kept so keen an outlook was none that figured in the sportsman's calendar as lawful and proper for the chase. Ulrich von Gradwitz patrolled the dark forest in quest of a human enemy. The forest lands of Gradwitz were of wide extent and well stocked with game. The narrow strip of precipitous woodland that lay on its outskirt was not remarkable for the game it harbored or the shooting it afforded, but it was the most jealously guarded of all its owner's territorial possessions. A famous lawsuit in the days of his grandfather had wrested it from the illegal possession of a neighboring family of petty landowners. The dispossessed party had never acquiesced in the judgment of the courts, and a long series of poaching affrays and similar scandals had embittered the relationships between the families for 3 generations. The neighbor feud had grown into a personal one since Ulrich had come to be head of his family. If there was a man in the world whom he detested and wished ill to, it was Georg Znaeum, the inheritor of the quarrel and the tireless game-snatcher and raider of the disputed border forest. The feud might, perhaps, have died down or been compromised if the personal ill will of the 2 men had not stood in the way. As boys they had thirsted for one another's blood. As men each prayed that misfortune might fall on the other, and this wind-scourged winter night Ulrich had banded together his foresters to watch the dark forest, not in quest of 4-footed quarry, but to keep a lookout for the prowling thieves whom he suspected of being afoot from across the land boundary. The roebuck, which usually kept in the sheltered hollows during a storm wind, were running like driven things tonight, and there was movement and unrest among the creatures that were wont to sleep through the dark hours. Assuredly there was a disturbing element in the forest, and Ulrich could guess the quarter from whence it came. He strayed away by himself from the watchers whom he had placed in ambush on the crest of the hill, and wandered far down the steep slopes amid the wild tangle of undergrowth, peering through the tree trunks and listening through the whistling and skirling of the wind, and the restless beating of the branches for sight and sound of the marauders. If only on this wild night, in this dark lone spot, he might come across Georg's name, man to man with none to witness. That was the wish that was uppermost in his thoughts. And as he stepped round the trunk of a huge beech, he came face to face with the man he sought. The two enemies stood glaring at one another for a long, silent moment. Each had a rifle in his hand. Each had hate in his heart and murder uppermost in his mind. The chance had come to give full play to the passions of a lifetime. But a man who has been brought up under the code of a restraining civilization cannot easily nerve himself to shoot down his neighbour in cold blood and without word spoken, except for an offence against his hearth and honour. And before the moment of hesitation had given way to action, a deed of nature's own violence overwhelmed them both. A fierce shriek of the storm had been answered by a splitting crash over their heads, and ere they could leap aside, a mass of falling beech tree had thundered down on them. Ulrich von Gradwitz found himself stretched on the ground, one arm numb beneath him and the other held almost as helplessly in a tight tangle of forked branches, while both legs were pinned beneath the fallen mass. His heavy shooting boots had saved his feet from being crushed to pieces, but if his fractures were not as serious as they might have been, at least it was evident that he could not move from his present position till someone came to release him. The descending twig had slashed the skin of his face, and he had to wink away some drops of blood from his eyelashes before he could take in a general view of the disaster. At his side, so near that under ordinary circumstances he could almost have touched him, lay Georg's Neighbour, alive and struggling, but obviously as helplessly pinioned down as himself. All round them lay a thick-strewn wreckage of splintered branches and broken twigs. Relief at being alive and exasperation at his captive plight brought a strange medley of pious thank-offerings and sharp curses to Ulrich's lips. Georg, who was nearly blinded with the blood which trickled across his eyes, stopped his struggling for a moment to listen, and then gave a short, snarling laugh. So you're not killed as you ought to be, but you're caught anyway, he cried. Caught fast. Oh, what a jest. Ulrich von Gradwitz snared in his stolen forest. There's real justice for you. And he laughed again, mockingly and savagely. I'm caught in my own forest land, retorted Ulrich. When my men come to release us, you will wish, perhaps, that you were in a better plight than caught poaching on a neighbour's land. Shame on you! Georg was silent for a moment. Then he answered quietly. Are you sure that your men will find much to release? I have men too in the forest tonight, close behind me, and they will be here first and do the releasing. When they drag me out from under these damned branches, it won't need much clumsiness on their part to roll this massive trunk right over on the top of you. Your men will find you dead under a fallen beech tree. For form's sake, I shall send my condolences to your family. It is a useful hint, said Ulrich fiercely. My men had orders to follow in 10 minutes' time, 7 of which must have gone by already. And when they get me out, I will remember the hint. Only as you will have met your death poaching on my lands, I don't think I can decently send any message of condolence to your family. Good, snarled Georg. Good. We fight this quarrel out to the death, you and I and our foresters, with no cursed interlopers to come between us. Death and damnation to you, Ulrich von Gradwitz. The same to you, Georg's Neighbour, forest thief, game snatcher. Both men spoke with the bitterness of possible defeat before them, for each knew that it might be long before his men would seek him out or find him. It was a bare matter of chance which party would arrive first on the scene. Both had now given up the useless struggle to free themselves from the mass of wood that held them down, Ulrich limited his endeavours to an effort to bring his one partially free arm near enough to his outer coat pocket to draw out his wine flask. Even when he had accomplished that operation, it was long before he could manage the unscrewing of the stopper or get any of the liquid down his throat. But what a heaven-sent draught it seemed. It was an open winter, and little snow had fallen as yet, hence the captive suffered less from the cold than might have been the case at that season of the year. Nevertheless, the wine was warming and reviving to the wounded man, and he looked across with something like a throb of pity to where his enemy lay, just keeping the groans of pain and weariness from crossing his lips. "Could you reach this flask if I threw it over to you?" asked Ulrich suddenly. "There is good wine in it, and one may as well be as comfortable as one can. Let us drink, even if tonight one of us dies."
"No, I could scarcely see anything. There is so much blood caked round my eyes," said Georg. "And in any case, I don't drink wine with an enemy."
Ulrich was silent for a few minutes, and lay listening to the weary screeching of the wind. An idea was slowly forming and growing in his brain, an idea that gained strength every time that he looked across at the man who was fighting so grimly against pain and exhaustion. In the pain and languor that Ulrich himself was feeling, the old fierce hatred seemed to be dying down. "Neighbour," he said presently, "do as you please if your men come first. It was a fair compact. But as for me, I've changed my mind. If my men are the first to come, you shall be the first to be helped, as though you were my guest. We have quarrelled like devils all our lives over this stupid strip of forest where the trees can't even stand upright in a breath of wind. Lying here tonight, thinking, I come to think we've been rather fools. There are better things in life than getting the better of a boundary dispute. Neighbour, if you will help me to bury the old quarrel, I will ask you to be my friend." Georg's name was silent for so long that Ulrich thought perhaps he had fainted with the pain of his injuries. Then he spoke slowly and in jerks.
"How the whole region would stare and gabble if we rode into the market square together. No one living can remember seeing a Zanaeum and a von Gradwitz talking to one another in friendship. And what peace there would be among the forester folk if we ended our feud tonight. And if we chose to make peace among our people, there is none other to interfere, no interlopers from outside. You would come and keep the Sylvester night beneath my roof, and I would come and feast on some high day at your castle. I would never fire a shot on your lands, save when you invited me as a guest. And you should come and shoot with me down in the marshes, where the wildfowl are. In all the countryside there are none that could hinder if we willed to make peace. I never thought to have wanted to do other than hate you all my life, but I think I've changed my mind about things too this last half hour, and you offered me a wine flask. Ulrich von Gradwitz, I will be your friend."
For a space both men were silent, turning over in their minds the wonderful changes that this dramatic reconciliation would bring about. In the cold, gloomy forest, with the wind tearing in fitful gusts through the naked branches and whistling round the tree trunks, they lay and waited for the help that would now bring release and succour to both parties. And each prayed a private prayer that his men might be the first to arrive, so that he might be the first to show honourable attention to the enemy that had become a friend. Presently, as the wind dropped for a moment, Ulrich broke silence. "Let's shout for help," he said. "In this lull our voices may carry a little way."
"They won't carry far through the trees and undergrowth," said Georg, "but we can try. Together, then."
The two raised their voices in a prolonged hunting call. "Together again," said Ulrich a few minutes later, after listening in vain for an answering halloo.
"I heard nothing but the pestilential wind," said Georg hoarsely.
There was silence again for some minutes, and then Ulrich gave a joyful cry. "I can see figures coming through the wood. They're following in the way I came down the hillside." Both men raised their voices in as loud a shout as they could muster. "They hear us! They've stopped! Now they see us! They're running down the hill towards us!"
"How many of them are there?"
"I can't see distinctly. 9 or 10.
"Then they are yours. I had only 7 out with me."
"They're making all the speed they can. Brave lads."
Are they your men? Asked Georg. Are they your men? He repeated impatiently as Ulrich did not answer. No, said Ulrich with a laugh, the idiotic chattering laugh of a man unstrung with hideous fear. Who are they? Asked Georg quickly, straining his eyes to see what the other would gladly not have seen. Wolves.
The Haunted Wood of Adoure by Elliott O'Donnell. There were three of us: Alphonse Duroc, literary editor of the Lyon Gazette, Gus Lawrence, sub-editor of the Chicago Saturn, and myself, and we were seated in the parlour of the only inn in Bretagne, discussing ghosts. Presently, Lawrence exclaimed, "Did you ever hear of an executioner being haunted? I have met quite a number in my time. Pete Barrow of St. Louis, Ed Gover of Saratoga, and a host of others, but when I have asked them if they have ever seen a ghost, and who more likely than a man who has sent so many people into the next world, they have only laughed." "That's in America," Duroc remarked quietly. "There seems to be some antagonism in that country of yours, either in the soil or the atmosphere or the people, that keeps ghosts away. In France it is different. I know an executioner in Lyon who once had a very startling experience with a ghost." "Tell us about it," I chimed in. "Eh bien," Duroc observed. "And remember, it is true. I guarantee it. Vibert, who narrated it to me, never lies. He is, what you call it, the very incarnation, embodiment of veracity, and it happened to him himself. At the time it occurred, he had only recently been appointed to the post of assistant executioner in the province of Bayonne, which, you doubtless know, lies about 50 miles to the southwest of the Cevennes. Well, one afternoon, to be correct, it was the last afternoon in 1900, he left Ravignon, the town where he resided, and set off on his bicycle, one of the old-fashioned sort, push-bikes I think you call them, for Delapour, to make arrangements for an execution which was to take place there in a week or so's time. His knowledge of Bayonne was, at that period, very limited, and as he had forgotten to bring his road map with him, he had to stop frequently to ask the way. This, added to the roughness of the roads, which for a considerable distance were undergoing repair, delayed him very considerably, and it was almost dusk when he reached Blanchepart, a tiny town lying barely halfway on the road to Delapour. Feeling hot and tired and badly in need of refreshment, he stopped at an inn and ordered refreshments. "Wise man," Lawrence remarked. "For a Frenchman, extremely sensible." "Bayonne red wine and chicken," Duroc observed, ignoring the interruption, "are excellent things when one is tired, and Vibert did justice to them both. Indeed, he dallied so long over his meal that the dusk had given place to darkness, and the shadows of night were already conspicuous by the roadside, when he finally got up from the table and asked mine host the nearest way to his destination. "The nearest way to Delapour," mine host replied, his eyebrows contracting in a slight frown, "is through the wood of Adoure, but I do not advise you to go that way tonight." "And why not, pray?" Vibert asked. "Is the track very bad?" Mine host shook his head. "No," he said, "the track is not bad. It isn't good, none of the roads in this part of Bayonne are good just at the present, but it is passable." "It is the wood itself, monsieur. It has not a good reputation." "Not a good reputation?" Vibert ejaculated. "Bears or robbers? Which?" "No, monsieur, neither one nor the other. The wood is haunted, and tonight, remember, is New Year's Eve." "Surely it is only on Midsummer's Eve and All Hallows' Eve that the spirits of the dead wander?" Vibert laughed. "That is so, monsieur," mine host said gravely. "It is the spirits of the living that are seen tonight, and they sometimes rehearse deeds and scenes that are none too pleasant. If monsieur is wise, he will shun the wood and get to Delapour by way of Baptiste and Saint Gabriel. Is that a much longer way? Vibert asked. It is longer by about 5 miles, mine host replied. That settles it then, Vibert answered lightly. Ghosts or no ghosts, I go through the wood. And after settling his account with mine host, he once again mounted his machine and set off in the direction of the wood of Adoure. Pedalling quickly through the main street of the little town that looked bright and festive, as it should do on New Year's Eve, he soon gained the high road, stretching as far as he could see into the gloomy countryside ahead of him. A few farm teams returning from their labour in the fields passed him, and an old-world slow-going wagon, with its tinkling bells, swinging lamp, and quaintly clad driver. And these were the only cheery sights and sounds he was destined to encounter for some time. For many a mile after this, the road led up a gradual ascent, and Vibert was exposed to the full fury of a sudden windstorm that howled and moaned piteously. Having at last gained the summit of the hill, he found himself on a seemingly interminable plateau. Overhead, ragged clouds drifted over a wild, lowering sky, and all around him no living thing was visible, except a few rooks, whose croaking voices blended well with the soughing of the wind. Anxious to escape from this inhospitable spot, Vibert rode on as quickly as possible, and eventually came to some crossroads, where a signpost pointed down a very steep descent to the wood of Adoure. Some half-hour's careful riding, for the ground was very rocky and full of ruts, at length brought him to the confines of a forest of seemingly vast extent. He guessed at once it was the wood of Adoure. He got off his bicycle to relight his lamp, which had suddenly gone out, and then, remounting his machine, pushed along a narrow track bordered on either side by tall trees, whose knotted and gnarled trunks gleamed a ghostly white wherever the moonbeams fell on them. The valley in which this wood was situated was far below the level of the road he had recently been traversing, and the wind, which had swept with great force across it, was here scarcely noticeable, and no sound save the faintest rustling of the tree-tops far overhead and the occasional crackling of brushwood under the feet of some wild animal of the night was to be heard. Having arrived at a comparatively smooth piece of ground, albeit the descent was into a slight hollow, he was pedalling rather fast down it when either a hare or a rabbit shot across his path, and in swerving to avoid it, he crashed into a boulder and was pitched over the handlebar of his machine. After a few seconds, he got up, feeling rather dizzy and shaken, to find the front of his bicycle practically crumpled up. He was deploring the prospect of being obliged to perform the rest of his journey on foot, trundling the 2 wheels along with him as best as he could, when through the naked branches of the trees, away in the distance, he espied a light. He at once made for it, and found, to his joy, it proceeded from a small house on the banks of a swift-flowing and very swollen stream. In answer to his repeated raps, the weather-beaten door was at length very cautiously opened, and a girl appeared on the threshold, with a lamp. By its sickly light he saw she had black hair, very dark and rather obliquely set eyes, high cheekbones, and perfectly even teeth that gleamed like pearls. She was good-looking, but it was in rather a strange way, and there was a curious glitter in her eyes as she stared at him that reminded him of the glitter he had seen in the eyes of leopards and other big animals of the cat tribe. Like so many French women, even of the poorer classes, she had very shapely hands with long tapering fingers and almond-shaped nails that shone like agates. In response to his request for a night's lodging, she demurred, but on his pleading inability to go any farther, owing to his complete state of exhaustion, she told him he could wait in the hall while she went to consult her husband. Apparently the house was very old. The hall was low-ceilinged and stone-flagged, and on one side of it was an ingle, and on the other a broad oak staircase leading to a gallery. Several oil paintings in tarnished frames hung on the oak-panelled walls, and in one corner stood a great-grandfather clock, a fishing-rod, and blunderbuss. Vibert had no time to take in further details, for the girl now suddenly appeared in the gallery, and telling him to come upstairs, bade him, before he did so, carefully to latch and lock the front door. On entering the room into which she ushered him, he received a surprise that almost amounted to a shock, for seated in an armchair by the fire was a feeble old man, who rose to greet him with difficulty. "My husband," the girl said shortly, avoiding Vibert's wondering gaze as she spoke. "He is an invalid," and she pointed to an array of medicine bottles on the mantel-shelf. "Henri," and she raised her voice almost to a shout, "this is the gentleman who wants a bed." "He can have one," the old man croaked. 6 francs bed and breakfast, and you pay me, not her. Money is not safe with women. They're too addicted to spending it." And he gave a feeble laugh which ended in a wheeze. "Asthma is one of his complaints," the girl explained. "He is seldom free from it. You would like some supper?" "If it is not giving you too much trouble," Vibert said gallantly. "I am famished." "Give him some ham and milk," the old man chimed in. "That is all we can do for you, monsieur, and it will be 2 francs extra. Food in these parts, and at this time of the year, is dear, very dear." And leaning forward in his chair, he waved his skinny hands over the crackling pine logs, the only cheerful sound, Vibert thought, in the house. Supper over, he consumed it, conscious all the time that the dark, slow-like eyes of the girl-wife were fixed on him with a strangely intent expression. He asked to be shown to his room. It was in a long corridor, lighted at the farthest end by an oriel window. The room, in keeping with the rest of the house, was low-ceilinged and oak-panelled, and had many curious nooks and corners, besides several cupboards inset in the walls. In the centre of the room stood a great, grim-looking 4-poster bed, with the usual ponderous canopy, and over this and everything hung an atmosphere of gloom. Directly the girl was gone, Vibert scrambled into bed. He put his lighted candle on a little table close to the head of the bed, but well out of the way of the curtains, and for some minutes read an evening paper he had bought during his journey. Tired after his long ride, however, he gradually dozed off, leaving the candle still burning. He awoke suddenly and completely, with a vivid sense of being no longer alone. Opening his eyes, he stared round, without lifting his head from his pillow, and reassured no one was in the room, he was about to close them again, when he suddenly heard the tap-tap of high-heeled shoes on the polished oak floor of the corridor, faint but distant, and growing nearer and nearer. All his faculties at once on the alert, he sat up in bed and listened. Saving for those sounds, all was silent, with a death-like oppressive silence such as one never experiences, save in lonely country places. There was not even a breath of wind stirring the leaves on the branches of the great elm trees outside, and inside not even the friendly scratching of a mouse to be heard behind the wainscoting. Nearer and nearer drew those footsteps, cautious, rather hesitating, but all the same persistent. They came right up to the door of Vibert's room, and halted. Vibert could feel someone was there, listening, intent on catching the sound of his breathing, in order to tell if he were asleep or awake. Recollections of stories he had heard about murders in wayside inns came crowding into his mind, and filled him with cold terror. It was so hopeless to be trapped here in this remote wood, miles away from any village or town, and in all probability far away from any other dwelling, and he was unarmed, too. Like a fool, he had forgotten to bring his revolver. He had a knife, a small pocket dagger, it was true, but of what use would that be against bludgeons or firearms? Would it not be better, he thought, to take the plotters by surprise and either burst through or attack them than to have them suddenly burst into the room and attack him? Besides, the suspense was intolerable. Naturally brave and impulsive, he decided to adopt the former course. Getting out of bed without making a sound, and tiptoeing noiselessly across the room, he turned the key quickly in the door and tore it open, expecting to see, if not several, at least one person, namely, the wearer of the high-heeled shoes. To his utter amazement, however, the corridor was absolutely empty. Nothing was to be seen there saving the moon, shining clear and bright through the oriel window, and on the walls, looking out from their gilt frames, the calm, immovable faces of men and women, ancestors, presumably, of the old man who occupied the house. Vibert stood for some time straining his ears, but he could catch no sound, not even the ticking of the clock in the hall beneath. Thinking it very odd, but persuading himself that he must have been mistaken, and that the sounds he had heard were due to rats, he shut the door softly, and, locking it, got back into bed. Once more he fell asleep, but only to awake, as before, very abruptly, and with a sensation of intense horror. The moonbeams poured in through the window, and illuminating the curtains on either side of it, made them appear like tall spectres. They gleamed, too, with an unearthly whiteness across the bed, and Vibert, constrained somehow to follow their course, observed that they shone with a peculiar intensity upon the door, and he could not remove his eyes from it. The handle of the door especially had a horrible fascination for him, and he kept watching it. He strove with all his might to look elsewhere, but he could not. All his senses seemed to be forcibly centered on it. Then, suddenly, he gave a great start. God in heaven! Was it fancy or reality? The door handle was turning. Slowly, very slowly, it turned, and the door began equally slowly to open. He tried to move, to do something, but he could not. His limbs refused to act. He was paralyzed and tongue-tied. Still the door kept on opening, while the moonbeams seemed to get whiter and colder, and the room fuller and fuller of them. Then, round the door there suddenly appeared a head and face, a bullet-shaped, close-cropped head with very projecting ears and dark, gleaming eyes that wandered round the room, and at last settled on the bed with ferocious glee. Vibert now became conscious of someone lying on the bed by his side. He saw nothing, for he was unable to remove his gaze from the face in the doorway, but he could hear the person beside him breathing, the deep, heavy inhalations of a person wrapped in profound slumber. Meanwhile, the door kept on opening, and at last into the room with soft, cat-like motion stepped a broad-shouldered, muscular man, holding in one hand a large horn-handled knife, the sharp blade of which gleamed hideously in the moonlight. Behind him, holding a basin in her hands, was the girl-wife, a look of horrible cruelty in her slow-like eyes. They approached the bed noiselessly, apparently too intent on the object by Vibert's side to notice Vibert himself. In a large mirror, i.e., a cheval-glass that stood facing the foot of the bed, Vibert now saw, reflected with frightful clarity, everything that happened. He saw the man seize hold of the head of the recumbent person by his side, whom he now recognized with a thrill as the old husband of the girl. He saw the girl place her basin under her husband's neck, and he watched her face light up with unholy glee as the cruel knife, flashing through the moonbeams, was drawn ruthlessly across the old man's throat. There was one awful gurgling groan, and then silence, broken only by the ghastly sounds of rushing, dripping blood. For some minutes neither of the murderers stirred, but stood by their victim, alternately gazing at him and at each other. Then suddenly Vibert caught them in the mirror looking at him. His candle had long since gone out, and the moon being at this moment suddenly obscured behind clouds, the room was now plunged in utter darkness. Vibert made a colossal effort to move and free himself from the fearful terror which rendered him powerless. It was in vain. After what seemed an eternity, the bed creaked, and a big, coarse hand gripped him by the throat. At this juncture, human nature succumbed, and he fainted. When he recovered consciousness and opened his eyes, the early morning sun was pouring in through the window panes, and someone was rapping loudly at the door. It was the young wife with his breakfast of coffee and a roll and fresh country butter. He looked around in fearful expectancy of seeing some signs of the terrible drama he had witnessed in the night. There were none, and when he tried the door, it was still locked on the inside. Much puzzled, for his experience seemed far too real and vivid for a dream, he took in his breakfast and, after consuming it, dressed and went downstairs. To add to his bewilderment, the old husband, who had played such a ghastly role in the midnight tragedy, was sitting in front of the log fire in the parlour, smoking serenely, and occasionally wheezing. "I hope Monsieur slept well," the girl-wife said, as Vibert, having settled his account, prepared to depart. "I had some rather queer dreams," Vibert replied, looking with no little admiration at her teeth, which, as I have already remarked, glistened like pearls. "Ah, monsieur, it was New Year's Eve," the girl laughed. "If they are unpleasant, I hope they won't come true." "I hope not, too," Vibert said dryly, and bidding her good-bye, he picked up his broken bicycle and resumed his journey. 10 months later, he was at Baptiste, this time in the capacity of executioner. It was a sudden call. Émile Gilgon, his chief, had been taken ill, and he was called upon to act in his stead. Hitherto, he had merely been Gilgon's understudy. He knew little about the case, saving that a man named Bonavent was to be guillotined for the murder of Gaspard Latour, a well-to-do, retired wine merchant of Marseille. The murder had been committed in the Cevennes district, and Latour's wife had assisted in it. Although she was probably the instigator of the crime, the judge who tried her, having regard to the verdict of the jury — French juries are noted for their leniency where women are concerned — merely sentenced her to a term of imprisonment. That was all Vibert knew. He was ignorant of the exact spot where the crime had been committed, and of the details of the case which had shocked all Bayonne. He did not see the condemned man till a few minutes before the execution, when, in company with 2 warders, he entered his cell to pinion him. He then received a shock. The man was the exact counterpart of the murderer in his dream or vision or whatever else it was that he had had on New Year's Eve in the wood of Adoure. This man that he was about to execute had the same bullet-shaped head, the same projecting ears, the same dark eyes, and the same short, broad figure. Also, he had the same huge, coarse hands. Vibert would have known them anywhere. He had felt their grip, and a shudder ran through him as he looked at them. As their eyes met, an expression of bewilderment came into those of the murderer, which expression suddenly gave way to a look of recognition mingled with diabolical hatred. Vibert said nothing. He simply pinioned the man and walked with him to the scaffold. When it was over and he was lunching with several of the officials of the prison, he asked them where the murder had taken place and how it was done. "Why, don't you know?" one of them replied. "What curious chaps you executioners are! In the wood of Adoure, of course. Bonavent cut poor old Latour's throat, while Madame Latour held a basin to catch the blood." A Neighbour's Landmark by M.R. James. Those who spend the greater part of their time in reading or writing books are, of course, apt to take rather particular notice of accumulations of books when they come across them. They will not pass a stall, a shop, or even a bedroom shelf without reading some title, and if they find themselves in an unfamiliar library, no host need trouble himself further about their entertainment. The putting of dispersed sets of volumes together, or the turning right way up of those which the dusting housemaid has left in an apoplectic condition,
appeals to them as one of the lesser works of mercy. Happy in these employments, and in occasionally opening an 18th century octavo to see what it is all about, and to conclude after 5 minutes that it deserves the seclusion it now enjoys, I had reached the middle of a wet August afternoon at Betton Court. "You begin in a deeply Victorian manner," I said. "Is this to continue?" "Remember, if you please," said my friend, looking at me over his spectacles, "that I am a Victorian by birth and education, and that the Victorian tree may not unreasonably be expected to bear Victorian fruit. Further, remember that an immense quantity of clever and thoughtful rubbish is now being written about the Victorian age. Now," he went on, laying his papers on his knee, "that article, The Stricken Years, in the Times Literary Supplement the other day, able? Of course it is able, but, oh, my soul and body, do just hand it over here, will you? It's on the table by you." "I thought you were to read me something you had written," I said, without moving. "But, of course—" "Yes, I know," he said. "Very well, then, I'll do that first, but I should like to show you afterwards what I mean. However—" and he lifted the sheets of paper and adjusted his spectacles. At Betton Court, where generations back 2 country house libraries had been fused together, and no descendant of either stock had ever faced the task of picking them over or getting rid of duplicates. Now, I am not setting out to tell of rarities I may have discovered, of Shakespeare quartos bound up in volumes of political tracts, or anything of that kind, but of an experience which befell me in the course of my search, an experience which I cannot either explain away or fit into the scheme of my ordinary life. It was, I said, a wet August afternoon, rather windy, rather warm. Outside the window, great trees were stirring and weeping. Between them were stretches of green and yellow country, for the court stands high on a hillside, and blue hills far off, veiled with rain. Up above was a very restless and hopeless movement of low clouds travelling northwest. I had suspended my work, if you call it work, for some minutes to stand at the window and look at these things, and at the greenhouse roof on the right with the water sliding off it, and the church tower that rose behind that. It was all in favour of my going steadily on, no likelihood of a clearing up for hours to come. I therefore returned to the shelves, lifted out a set of 8 or 9 volumes, lettered tracts, and conveyed them to the table for closer examination. They were, for the most part, of the reign of Anne. There was a good deal of the late peace, the late war, the conduct of the Allies. There were also letters to a convocation man, sermons preached at St. Michael's, Queenhithe, inquiries into a late charge of the Right Reverend the Lord Bishop of Winchester, or more probably Winton, to his clergy, things all very lively once, and indeed still keeping so much of their old sting that I was tempted to betake myself into an armchair in the window, and give them more time than I had intended. Besides, I was somewhat tired by the day. The church clock struck 4, and it really was 4, for in 1889 there was no saving of daylight. So I settled myself, and first I glanced over some of the war pamphlets and pleased myself by trying to pick out Swift by his style from among the undistinguished. But the war pamphlets needed more knowledge of the geography of the Low Countries than I had. I turned to the church, and read several pages of what the Dean of Canterbury said to the Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge on the occasion of their anniversary meeting in 1711. When I turned over to a letter from a beneficed clergyman in the country to a particular bishop, I was becoming languid, and I gazed for some moments at the following sentence without surprise. "This abuse, for I think myself justified in calling it by that name, is one which I am persuaded your lordship would, if 'twere known to you, exert your utmost efforts to do away. But I am also persuaded that you know no more of its existence than, in the words of the country song, that which walks in Betton Wood knows why it walks or why it cries." Then indeed I did sit up in my chair, and run my finger along the lines to make sure that I had read them right. There was no mistake. Nothing more was to be gathered from the rest of the pamphlet. The next paragraph definitely changed the subject. But I have said enough upon this topic, or its opening words. So discreet, too, was the namelessness of the beneficed clergyman that he refrained even from initials and had his letter printed in London. The riddle was of a kind that might faintly interest anyone. To me, who have dabbled a good deal in works of folklore, it was really exciting. I was set upon solving it, On finding out, I mean, what story lay behind it, and, at least, I felt myself lucky in one point, that, whereas I might have come on the paragraph in some college library far away, here I was at Betton, on the very scene of action. The church clock struck 5, and a single stroke on a gong followed. This, I knew, meant tea. I heaved myself out of the deep chair, and obeyed the summons. My host and I were alone at the court. He came in soon, wet from a round of landlord's errands, and with pieces of local news which had to be passed on, before I could make an opportunity of asking whether there was a particular place in the parish that was still known as Betton Wood. Betton Wood, he said, was a short mile away, just on the crest of Betton Hill. My father stubbed up the last bit of it when it paid better to grow corn than scrub oaks. Why do you want to know about Betton Wood? Because, I said, in an old pamphlet I was reading just now, there are 2 lines of a country song which mention it, and they sound as if there was a story belonging to them. Someone says that someone else knows no more of whatever it may be than that which walks in Betton Wood knows why it walks or why it cries. Goodness, said Phillipson. I wonder whether that was why... I must ask old Mitchell. He muttered something else to himself, and took some more tea, thoughtfully. Whether that was why... I said. Yes, I was going to say, whether that was why my father had the wood stubbed up. I said just now it was to get more ploughland, but I don't really know if it was. I don't believe he ever broke it up. It's rough pasture at this moment, but there's one old chap at least who'd remember something of it. Old Mitchell. He looked at his watch. Blessed if I don't go down there and ask him. I don't think I'll take you, he went on. He's not so likely to tell anything he thinks is odd if there's a stranger by. Well, mind you remember every single thing he does tell. As for me, if it clears up, I shall go out, and if it doesn't, I shall go on with the books. It did clear up, sufficiently at least to make me think it worthwhile to walk up the nearest hill and look over the country. I did not know the lie of the land. It was the first visit I had paid to Phillipson, and this was the first day of it. So I went down the garden and through the wet shrubberies with a very open mind, and offered no resistance to the indistinct impulse. Was it, however, so very indistinct, which kept urging me to bear to the left whenever there was a forking of the path? The result was that after 10 minutes or more of dark going between dripping rows of box and laurel and privet, I was confronted by a stone arch in the Gothic style, set in the stone wall which encircled the whole demesne. The door was fastened by a spring lock, and I took the precaution of leaving this on the jar as I passed out into the road. That road I crossed, and entered a narrow lane between hedges which led upward, and that lane I pursued at a leisurely pace for as much as half a mile, and went on to the field to which it led. I was now on a good point of vantage for taking in the situation of the court, the village, and the environment, and I leant upon a gate and gazed westward and downward. I think we must all know the landscapes, are they by Burkitt Foster or somewhat earlier, which, in the form of woodcuts, decorate the volumes of poetry that lay on the drawing-room tables of our fathers and grandfathers, volumes in art cloth, embossed bindings. That strikes me as being the right phrase. I confess myself an admirer of them, and especially of those which show the peasant leaning over a gate in a hedge and surveying, at the bottom of a downward slope, the village church spire, embosomed amid venerable trees, and a fertile plain intersected by hedgerows, and bounded by distant hills, behind which the orb of day is sinking, or it may be rising, amid level clouds illumined by his dying, or nascent, ray. The expressions employed here are those which seem appropriate to the pictures I have in mind, and were there opportunity, I would try to work in the vale, the grove, the cot, and the flood. Anyhow, they are beautiful to me, these landscapes, and it was just such a one that I was now surveying. It might have come straight out of Gems of Sacred Song, selected by a lady, and given as a birthday present to Eleanor Phillipson in 1852 by her attached friend, Millicent Graves. All at once, I turned as if I had been stung. There thrilled into my right ear and pierced my head a note of incredible sharpness, like the shriek of a bat, only 10 times intensified, the kind of thing that makes one wonder if something has not given way in one's brain. I held my breath, and covered my ear, and shivered. Something in the circulation. Another minute or two, I thought, and I return home. But I must fix the view a little more firmly in my mind. Only, when I turned to it again, the taste was gone out of it. The sun was down behind the hill, and the light was off the fields, and when the clock bell in the church tower struck 7, I thought no longer of kind, mellow evening hours of rest, and scents of flowers and woods on evening air, and of how someone on a farm a mile or two off would be saying, "How clear Betton Bell sounds tonight after the rain." But instead, images came to me of dusty beams, and creeping spiders, and savage owls up in the tower, and forgotten graves and their ugly contents below, and of flying time, and all it had taken out of my life. And just then into my left ear, close as if lips had been put within an inch of my head, the frightful scream came thrilling again. There was no mistake possible now. It was from outside. With no language but a cry, was the thought that flashed into my mind. Hideous it was beyond anything I had heard or have heard since, but I could read no emotion in it, and doubted if I could read any intelligence. All its effect was to take away every vestige, every possibility of enjoyment, and make this no place to stay in one moment more. Of course, there was nothing to be seen, but I was convinced that if I waited, the thing would pass me again on its aimless, endless beat, and I could not bear the notion of a third repetition. I hurried back to the lane and down the hill, but when I came to the arch in the wall, I stopped. Could I be sure of my way among those dank alleys, which would be danker and darker now? No, I confessed to myself that I was afraid. So jarred were all my nerves with the cry on the hill that I really felt I could not afford to be startled even by a little bird in a bush or a rabbit. I followed the road which followed the wall, and I was not sorry when I came to the gate in the lodge and descried Philipson coming up towards it from the direction of the village. "And where have you been?" said he. "I took that lane that goes up the hill opposite the stone arch in the wall." "Oh, did you? Then you've been very near where Betton Wood used to be. At least if you followed it up to the top and out into the field." And if the reader will believe it, that was the first time that I put 2 and 2 together. Did I at once tell Philipson what had happened to me? I did not. I have not had other experiences of the kind which are called supernatural or normal or physical, but though I knew very well I must speak of this one before long, I was not at all anxious to do so, and I think I have read that this is a common case. So all I said was, "Did you see the old man you meant to?" "Old Mitchell? Yes, I did, and got something of a story out of him. I'll keep it till after dinner. It really is rather odd." So when we were settled after dinner, he began to report, faithfully, as he said, the dialogue that had taken place. Mitchell, not far off 80 years old, was in his elbow chair. The married daughter with whom he lived was in and out, preparing for tea. After the usual salutations, "Mitchell, I want you to tell me something about the wood." "What wood's that, Master Reginald?" "Betton Wood. Do you remember it?" Mitchell slowly raised his hand and pointed an accusing forefinger. "It were your father done away with Betton Wood, Master Reginald, I can tell you that much." "Well, I know it was, Mitchell. You needn't look at me as if it were my fault." "Your fault? No, I says it were your father done it, before your time." "Yes, and I dare say if the truth was known, it was your father that advised him to do it, and I want to know why." Mitchell seemed a little amused. "Well," he said, "my father were woodman to your father and your grandfather before him, and if he didn't know what belonged to his business, he oughter done. And if he did give advice that way, I suppose he might have had his reasons, mightn't he now?" "Of course he might, and I want you to tell me what they were." "Well now, Master Reginald, whatever makes you think as I know what his reasons might have been I don't know how many year ago?" "Well, to be sure, it is a long time, and you might easily have forgotten, if ever you knew. I suppose the only thing is for me to go and ask old Ellis what he can recollect about it." That had the effect I hoped for. "Old Ellis," he growled. "First time ever I hear anyone say old Ellis were any use for any purpose. I should have thought you'd know better than that yourself, Master Reginald. What do you suppose old Ellis can tell you better'n what I can about Betton Wood? And what call have he got to be put afore me, I should like to know? His father weren't woodman on the place. He were ploughman, that's what he was.
And so anyone could tell you what knows. Anyone could tell you that, I says. Just so, Mitchell. But if you know all about betting wood and won't tell me why, I must do the next best I can, and try and get it out of somebody else. And old Ellis has been on the place very nearly as long as you have. That he ain't. Not by 18 months. Who says I wouldn't tell you nothing about the wood? I ain't no objection. And it's a funny kind of a tale, and 'tain't right to my thinking it should be all about the parish. You, Lizzie, do you keep in your kitchen a bit? Me and Master Reginald wants to have a word or two private. But one thing I like to know, Master Reginald, what come to put you upon asking about it today? Oh, well, I happened to hear of an old saying about something that walks in Betton Wood, and I wondered if that had anything to do with its being cleared away. That's all. Well, you was in the right, Master Reginald, however you come to hear of it, and I believe I can tell you the rights of it better than anyone in this parish, let alone old Ellis. You see, it came about this way, that the shortest road to Alan's farm laid through the wood, and when he was little, my poor mother, she used to go so many times in the week to the farm to fetch a quart of milk, because Mr. Allen, what had the farm then under your father, he was a good man, and anyone that had a young family to bring up, he was willing to allow 'em so much in the week. But never you mind about that now. And my poor mother, she never liked to go through the wood, because there was a lot of talk in the place, and sounds like what you spoke about just now. But every now and again, when she happened to be late with her work, she'd have to take the short road through the wood, and as sure as ever she did, she'd come home in a rare state. I remember her and my father talking about it, and he'd say, "Well, but it can't do you no harm, Emma." And she'd say, "Oh, but you haven't an idea of it, George. Why, it went right through my head," she says, "and I came over all bewildered like, and as if I didn't know where I was. You see, George," she says, "it ain't as if you was about there in the dusk. You always goes there in the daytime, now don't you?" And he says, "Why, to be sure I do. Do you take me for a fool?" And so they'd go on, and time passed by, and I think it wore her out, because, you understand, it weren't no use to go for the milk not till the afternoon, and she wouldn't never send none of us children instead, for fear we should get a fright, nor she wouldn't tell us about it herself. "No," she says, "it's bad enough for me. I don't want no one else to go through it, nor yet hear talk about it. But one time I recollect," she says, "well, first it's a rustling, like all along in the bushes, coming very quick, either towards me or after me according to the time, and then there comes this scream as appears to pierce right through from the one ear to the other, and the later I am coming through, the more like I am to hear it twice over, but thanks be, I never yet heard it the 3 times. And then I asked her, and I says, "Why, that seems like someone walking to and fro all the time, don't it?" And she says, "Yes, it do, and whatever it is she wants, I can't think." And I says, "Is it a woman, mother?" And she says, "Yes, I've heard it is a woman." Anyway, the end of it was my father, he spoke to your father, and told him the wood was a bad wood. "There's never a bit of game in it, and there's never a bird's nest there," he says, "and it ain't no manner of use to you." And after a lot of talk, your father he'd come and see my mother about it, and he see she warn't one of these silly women as gets nervish about nothing at all, and he made up his mind there was something in it, and after that he asked about in the neighbourhood, and I believe he made out something and wrote it down in a paper what very like you've got up at the court, Master Reginald. And then he gave the order, and the wood was stubbed up. They done all the work in the daytime, I recollect, and was never there after 3 o'clock. Didn't they find anything to explain it, Mitchell? No bones or anything of that kind? Nothing at all, Master Reginald. Only the mark of a hedge and ditch along the middle, much about where the quickset edge run now. And with all the work they'd done, if there had been anyone put away there, they was bound to find 'em. But I don't know whether it done much good after all. People here don't seem to like the place no better than they did afore." "That's about what I got out of Mitchell," said Phillipson. "And as far as any explanation goes, it leaves us very much where we were. I must see if I can't find that paper." "Why didn't your father ever tell you about the business?" I said. "He died before I went to school, you know, and I imagine he didn't want to frighten us children by any such story. I can remember being shaken and slapped by my nurse for running up that lane towards the wood when we were coming back rather late one winter afternoon, but in the daytime no one interfered with our going into the wood if we wanted to, only we never did want." I said, and then, "Do you think you'll be able to find that paper that your father wrote?" "Yes,
he said. "I do. I expect it's no farther away than that cupboard behind you. There's a bundle or two of things specially put aside, most of which I've looked through at various times, and I know there's one envelope labelled Betton Wood, but as there was no Betton Wood any more, I never thought it would be worthwhile to open it, and I never have. We'll do it now, though." "Before you do," I said. I was still reluctant, but I thought this was perhaps the moment for my disclosure. "I'd better tell you I think Mitchell was right when he doubted if clearing away the wood had put things straight. And I gave the account you have heard already. I need not say Phillipson was interested." "Still there?" he said. "It's amazing. Look here, will you come out there with me now and see what happens?" "I will do no such thing," I said. "And if you knew the feeling, you'd be glad to walk 10 miles in the opposite direction. Don't talk of it. Open your envelope, and let's hear what your father made out." He did so, and read me the 3 or 4 pages of jottings which it contained. At the top was written a motto from Scott's Glenfinlas, which seemed to me well chosen. "Where walks, they say, the shrieking ghost." Then there were notes of his talk with Mitchell's mother, from which I extract only this much. I asked her if she never thought she saw anything to account for the sound she heard. She told me, no more than once, on the darkest evening she ever came through the wood, and then she seemed forced to look behind her, as the rustling came in the bushes, and she thought she saw something all in tatters, with the 2 arms held out in front of it coming on very fast, and at that she ran for the stile, and tore her gown all to finders getting over it. Then he had gone to 2 other people, whom he found very shy of talking. They seemed to think, among other things, that it reflected discredit on the parish. However, one, Mrs. Emma Frost, was prevailed upon to repeat what her mother had told her. They say it was a lady of title that married twice over, and her first husband went by the name of Brown, or it might have been Bryan. "Yes, there were Bryans at the court before it came into our family," Phillipson put in. "And she removed her neighbour's landmark. Leastways, she took in a fair piece of the best pasture in Betton parish, what belonged by rights to 2 children, as hadn't no one to speak for them, and they say years after she went from bad to worse, and made out false papers to gain thousands of pounds up in London, and at last they was proved in law to be false, and she would have been tried and put to death very like, only she escaped away for the time. But no one can't avoid the curse that's laid on them that removes the landmark, and so we take it she can't leave Betton before someone take and put it right again." At the end of the paper there was a note to this effect: "I regret that I cannot find any clue to previous owners of the fields adjoining the wood. I do not hesitate to say that if I could discover their representatives, I should do my best to indemnify them for the wrong done to them in years now long past, for it is undeniable that the wood is very curiously disturbed in the manner described by the people of the place. In my present ignorance alike of the extent of the land wrongly appropriated and of the rightful owners, I am reduced to keeping a separate note of the profits derived from this part of the estate, and my custom has been to apply the sum that would represent the annual yield of about 5 acres to the common benefit of the parish and to charitable uses, and I hope that those who succeed me may see fit to continue this practice." So much for the elder Mr. Phillipson's paper. To those who, like myself, are readers of the state trials, it will have gone far to illuminate the situation. They will remember how between the years 1678 and 1684, the Lady Ivy, formerly Theodosia Bryan, was alternately plaintiff and defendant in a series of trials in which she was trying to establish a claim against the Dean and Chapter of St. Paul's for a considerable and very valuable tract of land in Shadwell. How in the last of those trials, presided over by L.C.J. Jeffreys, it was proved up to the hilt that the deeds upon which she based her claim were forgeries executed under her orders, and how, after an information for perjury and forgery was issued against her, she disappeared completely, so completely indeed that no expert has ever been able to tell me what became of her. Does not the story I have told suggest that she may still be heard of on the scene of one of her earlier and more successful exploits? "That," said my friend, as he folded up his papers, "is a very faithful record of my one extraordinary experience. And now—" But I had so many questions to ask him,
as for instance, whether his friend had found the proper owner of the land, whether he had done anything about the hedge, whether the sounds were ever heard now, what was the exact title and date of his pamphlet, etc., etc., that bedtime came and passed without his having an opportunity to revert to the literary supplement of the Times. Thanks to the researches of Sir John Fox in his book on Lady Ivy's trial, Oxford, 1929, we now know that my heroine died in her bed in 1695, having, heaven knows how, been acquitted of the forgery, for which she had undoubtedly been responsible. It All Came True in the Woods, by Manly Wade Wellman. When the horror, passing speech, hunted us along, each laid hold on each, and each found the other strong. In the teeth of things forbid and reason overthrown, Helen stood by me she did, Helen all alone. Rudyard Kipling. Helen took long steps to keep up with her father. Her chubby face, solemn in its pointed blue hood, turned up to him.
"What are these woods called, Daddy?"
she asked for the 5th time. The Indians called them Amasukit, Clay said patiently, blowing out blue smoke on the brisk autumn air. Can't you remember, Helen? You're 6 now, and you recited Horatius for the people at the cabin last night.
Horatius is easy,
Helen explained, as her short legs in ski pants made hoppy haste to stay beside her father.
Amasukit
And she achieved it at last.
is not. That's foreign.
She was silent, catching her breath, and Clay slowed to a saunter. No sense in wearing the child out, and the walk along this trail was too beautiful to hurry anyway. The brush that fenced them in on either hand offered every fall tint that was richest and brightest: lemon, peach, orange, scarlet, royal purple. As for the trees of the wood, taller and more distant, they might have been a sea-floor garden with their welters of warm red and gold clumped on their boughs. No, it isn't foreign, Helen, laughed Clay. Why, the Indians were the first Americans. They lived here for ages, before our people ever thought about the Mayflower.
Before George Washington?
That was Helen's ultimate conception of antiquity. Ever so long before, they had a right to name these woods.
What does the name mean, Daddy?
Clay drew on his pipe. It was a favorite of his, a big, bold English briar. Quite a time would pass, he mused, before he'd be buying any more pipes in England, what with the war and all. Helen was tugging at his hand to hurry the answer. Why, I've told you that too, he reminded. Amasukit, the trees of truth, because the Indians believed that any word spoken here came true.
Ooh.
Helen was again intrigued. She liked outings of any kind, and had danced when her parents took the cabin on the edge of this forest reserve for fall weekends. Now, if the place had a story attached...
All words come true,
she repeated with relish.
You mean like fairies and dwarfs?
Exactly, nodded Clay with the utmost gravity. Imaginative himself, he encouraged when he could any romancing his little daughter might attempt. Fairies and dwarfs.
Ooh!
Squealed Helen again, and glanced around searchingly.
Daddy, there was a dwarf right there, with a long beard and a red cap, peeking out from under that bush.
She pointed excitedly. Clay smiled down at her, and led the way around a bend of the trail. The shrubbery was thicker here, and its coloring even richer. Moss made the earth green under their boot soles. It was something to see, then, Clay remarked, still grave. He knew some parents, and despised them, who would call any child who claimed to see dwarfs a liar. But Clay remembered his own childhood, the vividness of his games and imaginings. Helen put her hands in her jacket pockets, imitating her father.
Are there witches here, too?
She pursued her inquiries. No. Her father would like to rule such thoughts out,
ever since a night of awful dreams after Betty had heard some Halloween tales. Whatever witches there were in this country got driven away by Cotton Mather, you know.
Is Cotton Mather here?
She asked at once. Cotton Mather is in heaven, said Clay. Let's stop while Daddy fills his pipe. Waiting, Helen glanced up at the half-hazy sky, as though she expected to see the old Puritan divine look out at her, dwarf fashion.
Well,
she said.
Are there giants in these woods?
Tamping down the tobacco in the bowl, Clay held a match to it. He shrugged in defeat. What can you do with kids? They simply throve on stories of excitement and danger and terror. He and Mrs. Clay had tried to hold Helen down to gentle fantasies like Peter Rabbit, but Helen's taste ran stubbornly to Red Riding Hood's wolf and even grimmer gentry. It came to Clay that in keeping the stories mild, he might be frustrating an instinct. That would be bad. What did J.G. Fraser have to say about such childhood tastes, or Irvin S. Cobb, or Freud? Clay decided not to deprive Helen further of giants. Bad dreams tonight would be on his own head. Oh, yes, indeed, he nodded. The trees of truth would be full of giants, big ones.
Bigger than you?
Suggested Helen, who considered her father to be of tremendous stature. Much bigger, darling, and bigger than Uncle Frank, or the football boys you saw last week. Twice, 3 or 4 times as big, taller than those trees yonder. Helen glanced at the trees and shivered.
How many eyes do they have?
She almost whispered. Only 1 eye apiece, improvised Clay promptly, remembering the Cyclops who imprisoned Ulysses. 1 eye in the middle of the forehead. But, on the other hand, they have each 2 or 3 rows of teeth, sometimes more, and as sharp as swords, and shaggy beards. She glanced over her shoulder at the trees and grew pale.
I'm afraid of them,
she said. But Clay had been thinking hard and fast to deal with just such a contingency. Don't worry, he told her. The giants can't hurt us, not when Daddy smokes this magic pipe all the way from England. He blew out a great cloud of blue vapor by way of punctuation, because giants are afraid of it.
Really, truly?
And Helen squinted hopefully at the pipe. Oh, yes, terribly afraid. They'd never dare come near enough to touch us. Clay began to mix in fragments of half-forgotten Indian lore, learned a generation ago in Boy Scout camp. You see, the old Indians used tobacco for a charm. Their medicine men smoked it to drive away bad things, spirits and witches and so on. Giants are bad things, just about the worst. They hate the smell of tobacco, especially, and he exhaled a bigger cloud, when it's a magic pipe, like Daddy's. Helen glanced at the trees once more, but not pallidly this time. Her chin was squared.
Well then, I won't be afraid of those old giants over there,
she announced sturdily. At her games again, thought Clay. Good girl, he applauded. Let's sit down here on this nice soft rock, and I'll tell you more things. He had meant to turn the conversation to the autumn colors of the leaves, discussing them in simple terms Helen's 6-year-old mind might digest. But as she took a seat beside him, she had no such idea.
What do giants wear, Daddy?
She continued on the subject which just now preoccupied her. They wear skins. He smiled down at her. Deerskins and bearskins, sewed together like patchwork, to make a piece big enough to cover them. Her eyes were still fixed on the middle distance beyond the brush.
What kind of shoes?
No shoes, of course. Their feet are too big for shoes, aren't they now?
I suppose so,
agreed Helen seriously.
I can't see their feet from here. What do giants eat?
Men, said Clay impressively.
Men who don't have magic pipes?
Yes. To comfort her, Clay blew smoke. Nobody had better come among the giants without tobacco.
They look scared,
announced Helen, and stood up as if to get a better view of something.
Look at them, Daddy.
Yes, you're right, nodded Clay, stooping to pick up a very brilliant maple leaf. Now, take this to Mummy when we get back, dear. Say that it's a souvenir of this walk in the woods.
You're not looking, Daddy. Not looking at the giants.
Helen was pointing insistently. To fall in with her humour, Clay lifted his head and looked. There were 3 of them, and not more than 30 yards away, taller than the topmost branches of the gorgeous red and gold trees. Clay could see them from the waist upward, above the thick trailside brush, lumpy, hairy, skin-clad, like the ugliest of colossal statues come to life. 2 had beards, one black, the other grizzled and blonde, and the third wore long gun braids hanging like lengths of cable at either side of a gross, hairless face the width of a bureau. So Helen had not been imagining giants after all. In the back of a brain that throbbed and whirled, Clay fenced off a tiny corner for what sensible thoughts he could summon. No time now, he told himself, to wonder how or why. The necessity was to get away, get Helen away at least. Without rising from where he sat, he caught Helen's shoulder and pressed her back and back, sliding her off the stone. "Darling," he said, wondering why his voice remained steady. "There are bushes near us. Crawl under them, far under. If there are thorny branches, get under those. Don't move or make a noise until Daddy has made those things go away from here. When you can't see or hear them any more, get up and run back along this trail we came. Get to the cabin. Once you start running, don't stop." He heard the dry leaves rustle as she silently obeyed. She was doing her part. Now he must do his. Springing up suddenly, as high into the air as he could, he flourished both arms over his head. At the top of his voice, he yelled, "Hi! Hi! Hi!" From his gaping mouth, the pipe dropped, bouncing on the mossy ground beside the rock. Clay turned and ran his fastest down trail. At almost the same moment he heard a mighty crashing, as of elephants among the timber. He permitted himself one backward look. The 3 great towers of flesh had sprung through the brushy hedge and were lumbering after him. All 3. None had paused to hunt for Helen. He felt a thrill of elation. Thus the parent partridge saves its hidden young, by diverting danger and pursuit after itself. He flourished his arms and yelled again. Then he saved his breath for running. No use. Their legs were longer than his entire body. One of their strides made 4 of his. Behind, then above, he heard a furnace-like panting. A grip fastened upon him, fingers as long as his arms. He was lifted from the ground in mid-career. The air rang with a deep, stormy growl, a concert of prodigious laughter. After one convulsive struggle, like a chicken in the jaws of a fox, Clay made himself go slack. He might have a chance later. Had best save his strength for that. If there was no chance, a doomed man should have dignity. The 3 gathered and exulted grossly over him, the 2 giants and the giantess. To them he was smaller than Helen would be to him, like a doll or a baby. He saw at close hand their eyes. Each had but the one, deep set in the middle of the low forehead, as large as tennis balls. Their mouths like open satchels, all studded inside with rows of pointed, sharky teeth, their hairiness, their patchwork skin garments, their bare feet like toe-fringed bolsters. Dangling in mid-air, Clay recognized his own handiwork. Among the Amasukit, the trees of truth, any spoken word became fact. The idle improvisations of a father diverting his little one had taken shape, flesh, life. The one who held him was the oldest, with a mat of buckskin beard turning grey. Some of his myriad teeth were broken. This captor grunted to the younger Blackbeard and the terrible woman mountain with the braids. The dark giant drew from his girdle thong a stone knife as long as a scythe, with which he began to whittle. First he uprooted a cedar sapling, and pared away its branches with powerful slashing digs of his blade. Then he sharpened the tip like a pencil. Beside the trail lay a fallen trunk of pine, dead and beginning to rot. Setting down his pole, the young giant caught this log in his huge hands, and with a single humping of his muscles wrenched it in two lengthwise. Kneeling, he set the sharpened point of cedar upon the exposed inside of one slab, and began twirling the stake briskly between his palms. Thus spun, the point drilled a hole. Woodmeal crawled out. It smoked from the friction, glowed. The giantess, with a fistful of shredded bark, evoked a flame that greatened and put forth smudge, fire made by rubbing sticks. Fire for what? Beneath big skillful hands the fuel quickly caught. The flames grew and climbed. The grizzled monster that held Clay nodded his big bushy head in approval. It was a cooking fire. His huge captor lifted him. The cedar point turned toward his stomach. The other two giants watched with relish, and the tongue of the giantess, like a red banner, came into view to moisten her lips. This, Clay thought with the corner of his brain kept sensible, was an end that nobody would ever believe. He would never be seen again. Helen, back at the cabin, would tell a story that would not make sense, even if searchers found his bones, stripped and crushed.
"You let my daddy alone,"
commanded someone close at hand. The voice was young, shrill and indignant. Clay, bracing himself to feel the crushing impalement of the cedar stake, knew that voice, and in despair counted his sacrifice as useless. Helen hadn't hidden, hadn't escaped. She had followed his abhorrent captors, was coming among them.
"Let him alone,"
she was repeating.
"or I'll—"
There was deadly, confident menace in her little girl voice. The grizzled giant lowered both his hands, with the spit in one and Clay in the other. His huge, single eye widened and protruded grossly. The firelight made it gleam like a very nasty jewel. The fulvid tangle of beard parted. The open mouth writhed over the rows of broken fangs. Clay managed to turn his head as he hung in the prisoning grip. He had never realized how small Helen was, how frail. She seemed barely as long as any one of the great bare feet among which she had planted herself. Her arms were set akimbo, her head flung back so that the hood drooped from it, her eyes glittered. So Clay had seen her often before, when her young temper was up. Only one thing was really strange about Helen. In a corner of her mouth, clamped tight between her 6-year molars, rode the English briar pipe he had dropped. Above and around Helen's ruffled hair whirled a wreath of tobacco smoke. Even as he saw all this, she puffed out a bigger, bluer cloud. "Why did you—" Clay tried to begin, but no words came. He was done for, unable to move or speak. Helen looked, not at him, but at the giants.
"I guess I'll show you,"
she squealed at the 3 staring hulks, just as she might have defied the biggest and roughest boy in her school. One giant, the black-bearded one that seemed youngest, was first to move. Very rapidly he lifted one foot and set it down again, well behind the other. Then he retreated a second pace, a third. The giantess, who had crouched to blow upon the fire, also moved backward on all fours, rather like a tremendous and revolting crab. Helen favored these fugitives with no more than a flick of her bright eyes. She wheeled toward the grizzled one, who still stood his ground, holding Clay like a trapped frog. Rising on tiptoe, Helen hooked one hand in her father's trouser cuff.
"You put him down,"
she ordered terribly.
"or I'll blow some more smoke, and you wish you had."
She suited action to word. Above Clay sounded a great hacking cry, as the giant choked and strangled. He felt himself released, falling heavily to the ground. The odor of burning tobacco smote his nostrils. He heard the heaviest of feet scrambling and stumbling away. He heard Helen laugh in harsh triumph, as Deborah might have laughed over the fall of Sisera's army.
"They're gone, Daddy,"
she said brightly.
"You shouldn't have dropped your pipe in the first place. But I remembered, giants hate tobacco. I came to save you."
Mist swallowed Clay, and he fainted gratefully. When he awoke, Helen was sitting beside the great dying fire, quite unconcerned.
"Did you have a nice sleep?"
she asked. He rose on his elbow. How long was I like that?
"Not very long. About 5 minutes, I guess."
She offered him his pipe.
"It didn't make me sick a bit."
Clay got up, shakily. Helen took his hand, as though it represented to her the surest pledge of safety. They turned homeward on the trail. "Helen," he said, "what has happened today?" Before I slept.
Oh, you mean about those giants? Why, just what you said.
She looked up at him, with a little wonder that he should not be sure. Then it had been true, among the trees of truth. She, too, had seen and known. "Helen, how were they driven away?"
With the magic pipe, Daddy. You know, I smoked it.
This as carefully and clearly as though she were the adult speaking to the child. "Why, Helen," he said, "this isn't Then he broke off. Better to be careful about talking away any protection. He asked another question. "You weren't afraid?"
Not with the magic pipe. You told me they hated it, and everything comes true in these woods, whether it's about giants or pipes.
Clay agreed in his heart that it was a thing not to be explained, only to tremble over his whole life long. Helen was more fortunate. 6 years old in a world of wonders and importance, to her 3 hungry giants were no more wondrous or important than many another thing. "Don't tell Mommy about this, Helen," he said. "We'll have it for our secret." She smiled and nodded, pleased by the word secret. Clay felt better. That would help matters now. Sometime when she was older, and mentioned the business as a childhood memory, he could get her to agree that it was a dream, grotesque, frightening, but only a dream.
Daddy,
Said the little girl.
Are there squirrels here too? Because I think I see one.
The Ordeal of Wooden-Face by Hal K. Wells. MacDonald forgot the smothering heat of the jungle night as he watched the miracle that was taking place there in his bungalow. For the dead eyes of Wooden-Face Jones were coming to life. The young American had come staggering into MacDonald's clearing 9 months ago, a nameless derelict with a nameless past. He could not have been over 30, yet his ravaged, set face was that of a very old man, and his eyes were the terrible lustreless eyes of a dead man walking in the night. He remained on at the bungalow as an assistant to the lonely Scotch naturalist. MacDonald gave him the name of Jones. The natives of the district added the descriptive sobriquet of Wooden-Face. Through the months, the sombre veil in the eyes of Wooden-Face Jones had never once lifted. But tonight, as Anson Borger's thick voice rasped on, the veil in the derelict's eyes was swiftly lifting, and the light which blazed in their depths was one that made even MacDonald's case-hardened nerves tingle. Borger, an official of a New York ivory firm, had been MacDonald's guest since morning. He was a flabby hulk of a man, with cold little pig eyes set in a heavy-jowled, whiskey-reddened face. Hours of steady drinking in an effort to deaden the soggy torture of the heat had finally loosened his tongue, until all reserve was now cast aside in a maudlin boasting of his past exploits. This young Garland had a fine job back in New York, a fine girl and all that, Borger was relating contemptuously. But why should I have had any squeamish scruples on that account? Why, we'd never even seen each other. I had the chance to use him for a stepping stone, and I took it. Garland got out of the United States just one jump ahead of the law. I got his job, and now I'm sitting pretty. I've never heard of Garland since. The young sap probably killed himself. No, he didn't kill himself, Borger, Wooden-Face Jones broke in softly. The light in the derelict's smouldering eyes was now a blood-red flame of hate. Garland fled to Africa. He's still here. Borger, I'm Garland. The ruddy colour drained swiftly from Borger's beefy face, leaving it oddly mottled. He gazed in terrified fascination at the revolver that was now in Wooden-Face's hand. "By using me for a stepping stone, Borga," Wooden-Face continued softly. "You mean that you juggled my books while I was on that western trip out of the office. Strange that I didn't guess it before, but I see it all now. The remedy is obvious. If you should happen to fail to return to New York, with what I now know, I can go back and clear myself." The muzzle of the revolver rose until it pointed directly at Borga's forehead. Borga was too sick with cold fear to even plead for mercy. For a long, tense minute, Wooden-Face Jones's finger tightened slowly upon the trigger. Then, with a cry that was half a sob, Wooden-Face abruptly lowered the weapon. "I can't do it," he groaned. "Not that way. If I'd kill you without giving you at least a chance for your life, I'd always be seeing that damned flabby face of yours in my dreams." Wooden-Face's eyes roved restlessly around the room, as though seeking inspiration. Then he noted the array of bottles on a sideboard over against the wall. He smiled grimly. He tossed the revolver over to MacDonald. "Keep that swine covered, Mac, while my back is turned." Wooden-Face walked over to the sideboard. "Borga, we'll go back to the Middle Ages to solve our little problem. You remember their old custom of trial by ordeal? There are cyanide salts in that jar. There is port wine in this bottle. I'll turn my back to you and hide these two glasses as I mix our drinks. In one of them I'll put cyanide. Then I'll let you choose which one you will drink. I will drink the other. One of us will go back to New York and life. Do you agree?" Borga's nod of assent was a little too eager, MacDonald thought. Then he saw the reason. In a mirror on the end wall, Borga was watching Wooden-Face's hidden hands as he prepared the drinks. One of the glasses was of green glass, the other white. It should be easy for Borga to identify the one into which the cyanide went. Wooden-Face seemed to take an unnecessarily long time to mix the drinks. MacDonald wondered if the derelict might not have noticed the mirror also, and be deliberately tricking Borga. He knew that Wooden-Face had phenomenally clever fingers. He often amused the natives with his sleight of hand. When Wooden-Face turned, there was a warning look in his eyes that silenced any thought of protest that MacDonald had. Borga's face was confident as he selected the green glass. "We'll drink at the same moment," Wooden-Face ordered. "The salty taste of the cyanide will immediately warn the loser, so we will drain our glasses at a single gulp." The two men lifted their glasses in a mocking suggestion of a toast, then drank. Borga strangled, then scrambled wildly to his feet, tearing at his collar. His eyes were fixed upon Wooden-Face with a terrible questioning. Wooden-Face merely smiled quietly as he set his empty glass down. Borga's face purpled hideously, and he fell heavily to the floor. MacDonald bent over him for a minute. "Dead," he announced crisply. "He got the cyanide glass after all, in spite of the mirror." Wooden-Face smiled gently. "There was no cyanide, Mac. I put nothing but a spoonful of common table salt in each glass." He tasted the salty tang, and saw that I was apparently unscathed. His own imagination, and that booze-soaked heart of his, did the rest. Church in the Jungles by Arthur J. Burks. I harbored no fear of the supernatural. There was more than enough nature around me of which to be afraid. I had roamed into the central Brazilian jungle south of Belterra that morning. I had lost my party. I had played the fool, as so many adventurers did. I had left my outfit to search the woods myself. They were all armed. I was not. I did not believe in firearms.
I didn't even carry a stick to smash snakes. I knew it was possible, even with a compass, to lose myself within 100 yards of the camp. I did just that. When darkness fell, terror rode me. I was not afraid of animals particularly. There was a possibility of being bitten by snakes, and I had had narrow escapes, but the balance of chance was against it. The other animals of the forest, the jaguar, ocelot, the great otter, gave man a wide berth. Other men had vanished into the jungles to be seen no more, but I felt pretty sure that one of two things had happened to them. They had been shot by Indians or stepped into holes. There was one other possibility. Animals sometimes broke off tops of shrubs, leaving spine-sharp points which hardened to rock-like consistency. If one fell on one of those points, it would be like Saul falling upon his sword. There were no Indians anywhere near Belterra that one needed to fear. Hadn't been for 50 years, maybe longer. My dread was holes. The jungles were filled with them. When it rained heavily, water stood in low places. Then the bottom fell out of such pools, literally. I'd almost stepped into holes 10, 12, 15 feet deep, and every one had been man-size. A man could step in, but without help he would never be able to get out of the hole. That was my principal dread when night caught me. I yelled. I was too far away even for the dogs to hear me. I yelled myself hoarse. I knew that the wise thing was to sit down and wait for morning. My comrades would expect me to do that. Then I'd be trailed and collected. I did sit down for a few minutes, but it takes a man with grim determination to sit quietly through the hours in the Brazilian jungles. So many things crawl, sniff, rattle the leaves, chitter, twitter, flutter invisible wings. Limbs break with sounds like pistol shots. It could be jaguar, tapir, the great otter. That sound could be the socorrijo, the python, creeping up to drop coils around one. No, the holes were preferable. Besides, walking in the dark, one could always slide the feet, test each spot before setting the foot down. In any case, one moved. I walked, sometimes bumping into the thick trees, sometimes putting my extended hands against spined palms. Occasionally, 100 feet aloft, a star peered through a space in the wind-whispering crown to see how I was making out. I yelled again. Nobody answered, but shortly after that I saw the lantern. It gave me a queer feeling, for we had no lantern with us. Back at camp, there was just the usual fire to keep off the jaguar, or to keep him warm if he wasn't afraid of fire. I don't believe in the supernatural, but I was thrilled a little anyway. I knew, if my Brazilian friend spoke truly, that there was nobody in our strip of jungle but us. I moved slowly, carefully, sliding my feet toward the lantern. As I went, I remembered a tale told last night of a haunted jungle church, occasionally reported by wanderers down the centuries. It wasn't in any given place. It just appeared when a wanderer was afraid, or approaching dangerous trouble, and somehow saved him. A ghostly priest, the tale said, signaled the wanderer with a swinging lantern. That lantern was real enough. I stepped into mud over my shoe-tops. I moved to the right, then to the left. I was on the edge of a swamp, I decided, and the lantern was out in it somewhere. That was really odd. It carried coincidence a bit further than most people would accept, for the ghost church always appeared on some safe, sound, high place in a swamp. There would be a way out to the lantern, a causeway of some kind. That's what the tale said, and common sense seemed to indicate the possibility. Ghost or real, the lantern swinger had got out there somehow. I found the causeway, a natural series of hummocks grown together, angling, twisting out into the swamp. There was no doubt now about it being swamp. I heard alligators grunt, lash their tails on the water. I didn't know whether to be glad or sorry I could not see. I did see red eyes, 2 by 2, watching me. Some of them came close, paralleling my course, but the causeway rose beyond their reach. I could see a priest now, holding the lantern high. I called to him, and he made some sort of answer which I could hear but not understand. I saw a building behind him. I could see its door, and well inside the door, candles. I reached the priest, scarcely knowing whether to laugh hysterically or take this all as a matter of course. I put forth my hand to grasp his, but whether by accident or design, he evaded my handshake, bowing slightly. He wasn't Brazilian, but German, I thought, or maybe American. There were German and American Franciscans in the valley of the Tapajos River, of which this uninhabited area was part. The priest indicated that I was to pass through the door. I understood then why speech was taboo. Some sort of ritual was in progress, solemn devotions. The priest signaled me to benches to my right as I entered. There were other men there, Brazilian and Indian. None of my people were here, however, and nobody turned to look at me. The priest who had signaled me to safety went forward. 2 other priests murmured in Latin at 2 altars to right and left, behind the communion railing. The priest who had awaited my coming proceeded to the higher, central altar. Mass was being read here by 3 priests. Odd, I thought. Down here I had never participated in night mass except at Christmas, but always early in the morning. But I knew little of the priestly craft, though I was not irreligious. The priests were cowled. There were kneeling women behind the benches to the left. Several of them were nuns in black, with black bonnets covering, or at least hiding, their faces. I knelt too, thankful I'd escaped until devotions were ended. Slowly, nuns and 2 of the priests whom I had not met rose and left the church, hands clasped before them, not looking at me. They had no interest in me. I could not see them too well, for I had been watching the flickering candles which had almost blinded me. The priest, who had doubtless saved my life, was the only one left. He stood before me, smiling. His face was white, beautiful, his teeth perfect. He held the lantern so that I could see his face. He wore brown habit, I noticed, the only one of which I was sure. "We are sorry we have no accommodations for travellers," the priest said to me in amazingly correct English, slowly and precisely, as if he first interpreted from some other language. "There are only ourselves. The sisters have a building out there." He moved his head to indicate outside to the right. "And we have a building on the other side of Igreja Perdida. But you may use my favorite place. Come." I got a slight bang out of his use of the words Igreja Perdida, for that had been the name of the ghost church my comrades had talked about around the campfire last night. Lost Church. The priest, he never gave me his name, led me to a place in the wall of the church where a tree grew right through, or where the church had been built around the tree. 2 huge limbs divided there to form an area bed-size, shoulder-high, that did look inviting. "I often meditate there," the priest said. "When there is no sound, alligators sometimes wander into the church. It is also not unknown to the python, but you will be quite safe. We are so poor, there won't even be coffee in the morning." "I'll be fine," I said. I saw one of the nuns, now snuffing the candles. I supposed she was the sacristan. "A night's sleep, and I'll be swell." He stood until I climbed up, sighed, straightened out. He stood until the candles were all snuffed and darkness was complete, save for his lantern. I didn't see what became of the nun. The priest went to the door by which I had entered, raised the lantern, snicked up the chimney, blew out the flame. Utter darkness descended. I had the vaguest idea of the church. Big, I thought. Big, old, falling apart. It had a musty smell. I slept like a log. I wakened with the sun in my face. I sat up in my big crotch of tree, looked around me. There was swamp everywhere. The snouts of many alligators rested on the water, beady eyes watching me, waiting for me to fall. I almost did, when I realized that there was no church, had therefore been no priest, lantern, nuns, candles, altars, incense, or mass. But could I ever be sure of that? How had I got out to my refuge in the blackness of night? That's what my friends asked me when, an hour after dawn, I heard their shouts, answered them, and they came to the edge of the swamp. I could find no way to get out of the swamp. It was 2 hours before they found a way in. Even then, I had great difficulty jumping from hummock to hummock behind them, going out. "How did you get out there?" they asked. "Jumped from back to back of the alligators," I said. "Nonsense." "Well, then, you remember that story you told me about Egregia Pagida? I saw a lantern. A priest was waving it. I simply followed it." I told them exactly what had happened to me. They didn't believe a word of it. It sounded too much like the ghost church tale they had told me the night before. I knew no way to change the story, however. Decay by J.C. Moore. Mr. Cotter had nearly finished his luncheon when he remembered suddenly that it was his 73rd birthday, and decided that he would celebrate it by a walk in his woods. No one had reminded him of the occasion, and his post had consisted merely of the usual batch of accounts rendered, and a disquieting note from his bank manager asking him to call next time he was in town. For the old squire of Cottersham was something of a recluse, and he lived alone, but for his housekeeper and 2 maids, in the gloomy, isolated Georgian manor. His wife had died 20 years ago, and he was childless. None of his relations troubled him, except with brief letters or cards at Christmas time, for everybody knew that he was heavily in debt, and that Cottersham was mortgaged up to the hilt of its value. So Mr. Cotter was allowed to go his own quiet way toward senility, happy with his trees and his garden and his books. It had drizzled for most of the previous week, and he had hardly been out at all. Today it was fine at last, and a silver-grey quietness of early October possessed the countryside. The brown leaves spun down from the tree-tops without the ghost of a wind to speed their parting. It was a muggy, heavy, somehow ominous day. Mr. Cotter took his favourite ash plant from the hall and went out into the garden. Last night's rain still shone on the laurel leaves and softened the colours of the autumn flowers in the beds. There was a faint mist at the farthest edge of the wide lawn. Mr. Cotter paused halfway down the path for a chat with Daniel, his head gardener, who was planting daffodil bulbs in a border. Daniel was cheerful and confident, as befitted one who was engaged in laying up a store of April gold. "We ought to have a nice show in the spring," he said. "Yes, good. Those dahlias look nice, Daniel." "A fine lot, sir." For 20 yards the dahlias blazed yellow and dark red, an epitome of autumn splendour. They wove themselves into a rich pattern, like a carpet of Ispahan, intricately made to delight the critical eye of Hassan, the confectioner. Yet somehow, for Mr. Cotter, theirs was a disturbing loveliness. They were arrogant and defiant because they saw the leaves fading on the trees and knew that winter, with its withering frosts, crept closer every day. Their defiance was a gesture of brave hopelessness, such as men make when they laugh and sing in the face of death. Mr. Cotter wished that instead of autumn it were springtime, with the earliest bees in his garden, and the dancing delight of daffodils swinging their little golden suns in the wind, and he and Daniel listening each day to hear the first chiff-chaff. For there was hope and bright certainty about the April days, and only a terrible and insecure beauty about October. Once he had loved it,
But that was long ago when he was young, and when winter meant hunting and wildfowling, and had no connection with bronchitis, no sinister connotation with the steady onward march of decay. Mr. Cotter turned away from his dahlias and went down the path towards the woods. Previous Cotters, living in England's prosperous days, had scorned alike greedy adventuring into newly found lands and safer but just as profitable operations on the soaring stock markets. The former they had regarded as legalized piracy, the latter as an ungentlemanly affair, little better than usury. They had been chiefly soldiers and scholars, and when they returned from their honest trade of war, or from the pursuit of knowledge in continental universities, they had always been content to settle in their Cottersham backwater, where they shot and hunted, bred shire horses, and planted trees. Today the great woods of Cottersham were their living memorial, but every sizable oak, beech, or larch had a grim price upon it, and lived only for so long as Ralph Cotter could afford to pay the interest on the mortgage. Each tree had a chip cut out of its bark, and a number painted on the white scar. It was the first mark of the axe, as Death, watching and waiting, will touch with his cold finger this man and that one, while the victim still laughs and goes among his fellows. Mr. Cotter decided that this afternoon he would walk through the plantation. It was a young wood, compared with the rest of Cottersham. Mr. Cotter's father had planted it 50 years ago, a mixture of larch and Scotch pine, and since then Ralph Cotter had thinned out some of the pine and put in quick-growing Douglas fir among the larches. The older woods round about consisted chiefly of deciduous trees. Beech and oak and hornbeam mingled their branches in masses half a mile deep. Little birches, as graceful as gazelles, made up the smaller coppices. Old dreamy elms and sanctimonious horse-chestnuts formed an avenue down the drive and stood aloofly in the parkland. But of all his woods, the plantation was Mr. Cotter's favourite, perhaps because the larches and the young firs grew quickly and permitted an old man to watch the result of his handiwork, whereas the stolid oaks elsewhere took no account of human mortality, reckoning mankind's allotted 80 years and 10 but half of their youth, and demanding as much again ere they came to maturity. Mr. Cotter did not plant oak nowadays, because he knew that long before it was sapling size he would be no more than mould for it, and he walked chiefly among his spruces and firs and larches and pines, and watched them grow up as he tended them. For other reasons besides, he loved these woods the best. The conifers gave out a sweet, resinous smell, and their needles were soft underfoot. There was no riotous undergrowth, no tangle of hazel and briars to trip an old man up or flip twigs catapult-like into his eyes. Only the straight brown regimented trunks rose up all round him like a bodyguard. He knew them all so well that he could tell offhand how tall a tree was without looking up to the top of it. He knew their moods, too, how they seemed to change their colour from hour to hour and season to season, as no other trees could change, how they were rosy at dawn and golden at clear sunsets, tawny on bright days and sepia on sombre ones, black in wet weather and purplish in the late dusks of summer. They had a shade for every mood, and a mood for every person, so that their swaying branches mourned when a man was sad, and they laughed in their windy tops when he was merry. For they were friendly and sympathetic trees. They were not impartial and aloof like the oaks, nor cold and queenly like the beeches. They seemed to know how one felt when one walked among them, and to match their spirit to one's own. Only one of their moods was wilful and incomprehensible, and they showed it but rarely. 2 or 3 times a year, when the great winds came, they went suddenly mad. Then their topmost branches sobbed and shrieked like demoniac violins, crying aloud with a pain that was like the agony of poets when loveliness tears at their hearts, and yet close to the ground, where the trunks rose up straightly, there was always a queer and expectant stillness, so that to stand there was like being sheltered and secure in a monastery, around which the turbulent world went its vain and noisy and terrible way. Perhaps, thought Mr. Cotter on these occasions, Cottersham was his hushed cloister, at whose gates a new world clamoured insistently, a world born in conflict and unrestful as the sea, a world of which he knew nothing, but which would soon engulf him and swamp his quietude in a swirling, choking flood. Walking between his larches today, Mr. Cotter recognized them all as old friends. Had he not personally superintended each thinning for over 30 years, weighing up the merits of this tree against the merits of that one? Had he not planted many of them with his own hands, and watched them grow from foot-high seedlings to trees 40 foot tall? Had he not guarded them season by season from high winds by planting a shelter belt of sycamore, from autumn and spring frosts, from smothering by their light, greedy brothers, from drought and cockchafer and weevil and rabbits, from all the other ills and perils of the forest? Whenever he went through his woods, Mr. Cotter looked out constantly for signs of his tree's enemies. Drooping seedlings hinted that cockchafers were busy, and Daniel would have to spend a day or two collecting the soft, obscene grubs which bit off the roots with their sharp mandibles. Peeled stems might signify rabbits or voles, which must be trapped or excluded. Gnawed bark higher up the trees was a sign of the pine weevil, the little black beetle with the long snout and the 3 gold bars on his back. Daniel's children must be set the job of collecting them, and paid a penny for every 100 they took. Nipped cotyledons and larches girdled near the top was the work of the squirrels, but against them, the gay red fellows, Mr. Cotter would take no measures at all, and he willingly sacrificed to them a few dozen seedlings, and maybe a grown tree or two every season, a tithe paid readily because of their sleek beauty and the frisking gaiety that was theirs. One more foe yet waged ceaseless battle against the trees. Mr. Cotter dreaded it and hated it more than all the others put together. It was stealthy and invisible, and but for a single month of the year was its actual presence seen. At other seasons, only its results were manifest. The trees swelled and blistered, their bark peeled off, weeping slow trickles of turpentine. Their needles went yellow, dried up, and fell away. Soon the tree died, and still its assailant remained hidden, secret, unseen. Then suddenly, on a dank October day, as if in horrible triumph it blazed forth blatantly. A host of bright yellow toadstools appeared in clusters round the base of the tree, rising up out of the mould to mock the dead thing with their dreadful, living parody of death. For when Mr. Cotter touched them with his foot, they collapsed stickily, lost their flaming colour, and rotted, stinking. Mr. Cotter loathed them, not so much for what they did, as for what they were. They produced in him a sort of queasiness, a definite nausea, and a strange and unreasoning fear. It was with a queer apprehension that he noticed this afternoon a yellow speckling on the ground, and realized that the season of the fungi had come. Unconsciously, he quickened his pace as he walked towards it. They were toadstools, right enough. They clustered round the trunk of a felled larch, and from a distance they looked like a patch of celandines or pimpernel flowering out of their time. But they had not the innocence of flowers. They were sophisticated and intrinsically evil. Even their gaudy colour was sinister, unhealthy, and obscene. Mr. Cotter remembered cutting down the larch last winter, because he had suspected then that the honey fungus was attacking it. He had felled it alone. That was before the doctor had forbidden such exercise, hinting grimly at an aortic aneurysm. Well, it might be. The doctor had asked questions which had nothing to do with Mr. Cotter's heart,
and Mr. Cotter had smiled queerly in reply. "The way of a man in his youth, Doctor. One of the things which no man knows." That youth seemed so far away, so lost, so irrelevant, that it might have been somebody else's, nothing to do with him. But here and there amid the waste was green memory. "We pay," said Mr. Cotter shortly, accepting the unspoken verdict. So it wasn't this year, next year sometime. The last possibility had been ruled out, and Mr. Cotter was afraid of death. If only he could believe with the Christians that it was but the opening of the gates into a new and delectable existence. But the supposition was ridiculous, unreasonable. Mr. Cotter had a mind trained on the taut logic of the Greeks and the sharp, cynical downrightness of Horace and Martial. Though he might subconsciously wish to do so, he steadfastly refused to play with the comforting nonsense about life in the hereafter. The theory was unsupported by a tittle of evidence. It was a dream of mystics and madmen, a straw clutched at by men drowning and afraid. Mr. Cotter would have nothing to do with it. At 73, he looked death straight in the face. But what a leering, hideous countenance it was! There was no beauty in it, and the very thought of it always terrified him. One's dust might dissolve into dust, help to build up new cells, new living creatures in the old, unceasing roundabout of nature. But the soul, the vital spark, what became of that? Vacancy, just vacancy. There was the darkness and the despair. It was said that there came to old people a great peace, the quietude of life's evening, so that they were enabled to await with equanimity the beckoning tap on the shoulder which would come so inevitably, so soon. Mr. Cotter knew that it was a cruel lie. If any among mortals could face death calmly, it was the young, not the old, who could do so. For they felt, perhaps, like Peter Pan, that it was a great adventure, the solution of the insoluble mystery, the answer to the unanswerable question. But Mr. Cotter did not want adventure, and he had long ago answered that question in his own mind. He wanted to stay in the world where trees faded yellow in autumn and budded green in the spring, where he could plant daffodil bulbs in September and be sure that a golden harvest would gladden his eyes in the following April. Now he could never be sure. He wouldn't go easily, he knew. He loved life still, after his own fashion. He would have to be cut down violently, torn away from it like that tree, the last that he had felled. He remembered the manner of its falling, how it had first creaked a faint protest and trembled slightly when he put his shoulder against it. One more blow, and he stood aside at right angles to the trunk. The larch swayed and began to creak more loudly. The creak became a deep groan, a crackle, a long, shuddering sob. Then suddenly, as it came down, it gave that long, high-pitched shriek which all living trees give when they fall, a sound like the mandrake's mythical scream, that seems to be verily torn out of them, a sort of death rattle, the cry of their tortured spirit which leaves them unwillingly. Then there was a crash. The brittle branches split with the sound of pistol shots as they met the ground. A host of little twigs crackled a chorus, and there followed a minute's deep silence while the wood mourned the tree and paid its last tribute to it. The creatures of the forest paused and listened to the stillness. At last, a jay screeched. The silence was over, the obsequies done. The larch as a tree was forgotten by the wood. It was become a log, and until it was cut up and taken away, the beetles might make their home under it, and the little mice have their habitation there. That was death, thought Mr. Cotter. One just ceased, and life, pitiless, urgent, went on without one. He sat down on the trunk. He remembered that he had meant to have it cleared away, knowing that it was rotten and diseased.
He had looked under the bark and had found there the thin, ribbon-like mycelium of the fungus, which would spread quickly to the other trees. He ought to have told Daniel to take it away. When one was old, one was always forgetting things. Mr. Cotter sat still, listening, as was his habit, for the small sounds of bird and beast going about their affairs. There were none. The wood was strangely, disconcertingly still. No jay, no little owl, no scampering of mice, not even the cheering flash of a squirrel's bushy tail. There was a mist on the horizon that looked like wood smoke, a colour which is somehow the predominant motif of October eventides. The trunks of the larches were bluish too, like half-burned logs, and everything was silent and damp and dripping. Even the log on which Mr. Cotter sat felt wet and slimy when he touched it. He looked at the place where his hand was, and drew his hand suddenly away. He was touching a patch of silver-grey fungus which had erupted on the bark. He had seen it before he sat down, but had thought that it was lichen, by which nature contrives to make certain dead things beautiful. But lichen was clean and dry, whereas this stuff was sticky and soft. Mr. Cotter wiped his fingers on his handkerchief and got up quickly. Dusk was falling, and it was time to go home. In the house, beside the cheerful fire, he would read a book written by an old Roman poet long ago, and so forget unpleasant things. He swung his stick and started to walk briskly. But before he had gone 10 paces, he noticed that there was something curiously wrong with the trunk of the larch nearest to the fallen one, and went closer to investigate it. He stood and stared at it. Then, with growing disquiet, his glance travelled to the other trees round about. The same strange rottenness had come to all of them. There were fungi everywhere. Their abundance and their diversity were such as Mr. Cotter had never seen before. Their forms were varied and horrible. Some grew out, bracket-shaped, on the tree itself, like huge, soapy cheeses. Some had the shapes of toadstools and poked up venomous heads out of the soil at the base of the trunk. Some appeared like little blisters on the bark. They were snow-white and spotted, and scarlet and canary yellow, and bright orange-red. Mr. Cotter had seen the latter before. They reminded him unpleasantly of the year's fashionable colour of lipstick. He had been up to London last summer and had noticed with a shudder that all the girls in the streets looked as if they had walked in the October woods and kissed the horrible things, bearing away forever the ineradicable mark of their madness. But there were worse ones now than the orange fungi. There were some which were parchment colour, and maculate as if with some loathsome disease, and there were some more which were entirely colourless. These were neither white, nor grey, nor brown. The most that one could say of them was that they had a sort of greyish-yellow pallor, the colour of death, if that be a colour at all. Mr. Cotter had never seen them before, and a sudden, unreasonable anger caused him to hit one of them with his stick. It bruised dreadfully, as if to show that it was alive, just alive in its obscene and unhealthy way. It bruised bluish, then went green and yellow like a rotting corpse, and dripped wet mildew down the tree trunk until it was nothing but a mass of slime, dripping and dripping, disintegrating altogether. Mr. Cotter stood and watched it in fascinated horror. It was growing very dark in the wood. Mr. Cotter pulled himself together and turned away. He must get home. The trees stood closely round him and seemed to be hemming him in. He must hurry away from these nasty fancies. He walked for a few yards and perceived another of the grey fungi. Its thick, pallid bracket nearly girdled the tree on which it grew. Mr. Cotter raised his stout ash plant again and smote it. A piece chipped off it, and a bluish wheal appeared on it where the stick had fallen. Horrible!
All the trees must be rotten to the core. Mr. Cotter stepped aside and felt something crush underneath his foot. He looked down and saw that he had trodden on a brown puffball. It smoked still into the quiet air. Mr. Cotter kicked at it, slipped, put out a hand towards the tree trunk to steady himself, and touched the big grey fungus. It was cold and soft, and it felt dead. Mr. Cotter felt a horrible nausea rising within him, and with the nausea a great fury, so that he lifted his stick and beat the fungus, aiming wild blows at it, one after another, until there was nothing left of it at all but pulp that had a rotten smell. Even as he slew it, he saw out of the corner of his eye another one at his left hand, and yet a third at his right. He ran at them and slashed them in turn. He looked round, and there were more on the furze behind him. He struck so hard that he broke the end of his stick. Yet he dared not stop now, for he felt queerly that he could not stand suddenly quiet in the midst of those pulped grey things, smelling the rotten smell of them. Darkness fell, and Mr. Cotter's breath came shorter as he went in demoniac fury from tree to doomed tree, seeing his own doom in each, while the October mist rose up round the darkening boughs, and the quiet wood watched.
The Vengeance of a Tree by E.F. Lewis. Through the windows of Jim Daly's saloon, the setting sun streamed in yellow patches, lighting up the glasses scattered on the tables, and the faces of several men who were gathered near the bar. Farmers mostly they were, with a sprinkling of shopkeepers, while prominent among them was the village editor, and all were discussing a startling piece of news that had spread through the town and its surroundings. The tidings that Walter Stedman, a labourer on Albert Kelsey's ranch, had assaulted and murdered his employer's daughter had reached them, and had spread universal horror among the people. A farmer declared that he had seen the deed committed as he walked through a neighbouring lane, and, having always been noted for his cowardice, instead of running to the girl's aid, had hailed a party of miners who were returning from their midday meal through a field nearby. When they reached the spot, however, where Stedman, as they supposed, had done his black deed, only the girl lay there, in the stillness of death. Her murderer had taken the opportunity to fly. The party had searched the woods of the Kelsey estate, and just as they were nearing the house itself, the appearance of Walter Stedman, walking in a strangely unsteady manner toward it, made them quicken their pace. He was soon in custody, although he had protested his innocence of the crime. He said that he had just seen the body himself on his way to the station, and that when they had found him he was going to the house for help, but they had laughed at his story and had flung him into the tiny, stifling calaboose of the town. What were their proofs? Walter Stedman, a young fellow of about 26, had come from the city to their quiet town, just when times were at their hardest, in search of work. The most of the men living in the town were honest fellows, doing their work faithfully when they could get it, and when they had socially asked Stedman to have a drink with them, he had refused in rather a scornful manner. That infernal city chap, he was called, and their hate and envy increased in strength when Albert Kelsey had employed him in preference to any of themselves. As time went on, the story of Stedman's admiration for Margaret Kelsey had gone afloat, with the added information that his employer's daughter had repulsed him, saying that she would not marry a common labourer. So Stedman, when this news reached his employer's ears, was discharged, and this, then, was his revenge. For them, these proofs were sufficient to pronounce him guilty. Yet that afternoon, as Stedman, crouched on the floor of the calaboose, grew hopeless in the knowledge that no one would believe his story, and that his and deserved punishment would be swift and sure. A tramp, boarding a freight car several miles from the town, sped away from the spot where his crime had been committed, and knew that forever its shadow would follow him. From the tiny window of his prison, Walter Stedman could see the red glow of the heavens that betokened the setting of the sun. So the red sun of his life was soon to set, a life that had been innocent of all crime, and that now was to be ended for a deed that he had never committed. Most prominent of all the visions that swept through his mind was that of Margaret Kelsey, lying as he had first found her, fresh from the hands of her murderer. But there was another of a more tender nature. How long he and Margaret had tried to keep their secret, until Walter could be promoted to a higher position, so that he could ask for her hand with no fear of the father's antagonism. Then came the remembrance of an afternoon meeting between the two in the woods of the Kelsey estate. How, just as they were parting, Walter had heard footsteps near them, and, glancing sharply around, saw an evil, scowling, murderous face peering through the brush. He had started toward it, but the owner of the countenance had taken himself hurriedly off. The gossiping townspeople had misconstrued this romance, and when Albert Kelsey had heard of this clandestine meeting from the man who was later on to appear as a leader of the mob, and that he had discharged Stedman, they had believed that the young man had formally proposed and had been rejected. But justice had gone wrong, as it had done innumerable times before, and will again. An innocent man was to be hanged, even without the comfort of a trial, while the man who was guilty was free to wander where he would. That autumn night the darkness came quickly, and only the stars did their best to light the scene. A body of men, all masked, and having as a leader one who had ever since Stedman's arrival in town cherished a secret hatred of the young man, dragged Stedman from the calaboose and tramped through the town, defying all, defying even God himself. Along the highway and into Farmer Brown's cross-cut they went, vigilantly guarding their prisoner, who, with the lanterns lighting up his haggard face, walked among them with a lagging step of utter hopelessness. "That's a good tree," their leader said presently, stopping and pointing out a spreading oak. When the slipknot was adjusted and Stedman had stepped on the box, he added, "If you've got anything to say, you'd better say it now." "I am innocent, I swear before God," the doomed man answered. "I never took the life of Margaret Kelsey." "Give us your proof," jeered the leader, and when Stedman kept a despairing silence, he laughed shortly. "Ready, men," he gave the order. The box was kicked aside, and then only a writhing body swung to and fro in the gloom. In front of the men stood their leader, watching the contortions of the body with silent glee. "I'll tell you a secret, boys," he said suddenly. "I was after that poor murdered girl myself. A little chance I had, but he had just as little." A pause. Then, "He shunted this earth. Cut him down, you fellows." "It's no use, son. I'll give up the blasted thing as a bad job. There's something queer about that there tree. Do you see how its branches balance it? We have cut the trunk nearly in two, but it won't come down. There's plenty of others around. We'll take one of them. If I'd a long rope with me, I'd get that tree down. And yet the way the thing stands, it would be risking a fellow's life to climb it. It's got the devil in it, sure." So old Farmer Brown shouldered his axe and made for another tree, his son following. They had sawed and chopped and chopped and sawed, and yet the tall white oak, with its branches jutting out almost as regularly as if done by the work of a machine, stood straight and firm. Farmer Brown, well known for his weak, cowardly spirit, who, in beholding the murder of Albert Kelsey's daughter, had in his fright mistaken the criminal, now in his superstition let the oak stand, because its well-balanced position saved it from falling, when other trees would have been down. And so this tree, the same one to which an innocent man had been hanged, was left for other work. It was a bleak, rainy night, such a night as can be found only in Central California. The wind howled like 1,000 demons and lashed the trees together in wild embraces. Now and then the weird hoot-hoot of an owl came softly from the distance in the lulls of the storm, while the barking of coyotes woke the echoes of the hills into sounds like fiendish laughter. In the wind and rain, a man fought his path through the bush and into Farmer Brown's crosscut as the shortest way home. Suddenly he stopped, trembling, as if held by some unseen impulse. Before him rose the white oak, wavering and swaying in the storm. "Good God! It's the tree I swung Stedman from!" he cried, and a strange fear thrilled him. His eyes were fixed on it, held by some undefinable fascination. Yes, there on one of the longest branches a small piece of rope still dangled, and then, to the murderer's excited vision, this rope seemed to lengthen, to form at the end into a slip-knot, a knot that encircled a purple neck, while below it writhed and swayed the body of a man. "Damn him!" he muttered, starting toward the hanging form, as if about to help the rope in its work of strangulation. "Will he forever follow me? And yet he deserved it, the black-hearted villain. He took her life—" He never finished the sentence. The white oak, towering above him in its strength, seemed to grow like a frenzied living creature. There was a sudden splitting sound. Then came a crash, and under the fallen tree lay Stedman's murderer, crushed and mangled. From between the broken trunk and the stump that was left, a grey, dim shape sprang out and sped past the man's still form, away into the wild blackness of the night. If you enjoyed listening today, be sure to subscribe to the channel by hitting the red subscribe button below. After doing so, click the bell icon next to the subscribe button to receive new content notifications. If you'd like to support our work and receive exclusive perks, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button below. To support us in other ways, see the video description for links to our Bandcamp and Patreon pages, our merch store over at Teespring, and further information relating to our releases on Audible, iTunes, and Spotify. And until next time,